I had never met the guy before that night. What my friends and I did was extremely foolish. Given the crowd we rolled with, it was fortunate that we didn't end up as ghosts ourselves. I was part of the goth scene in high school. These were the prime years of Hot Topic fashion, where every town had a garage band that played scene music, and every school had a little collection of black-clad figures who smoked out behind the gym. I was a poster child for goth culture. Eyeliner, hair like an oversprayed raven wing, fishnets, combat boots, the whole 9 yards. The school hated our little clique, mostly due to truancy and the little pile of butts we left out behind the gym, but we didn't care. It was all part of the aesthetic, right? October may have meant costumes and candy when we were younger, but now that we were older, October was 30 days of celebration. On any given afternoon, my friends and I could wander downtown and hear someone telling spooky stories on the corner, take part in a ghost tour, or listen to someone playing a saw or something spooky with scavenged instruments. Downtown had a sizable artistic scene, and October was also their month to cash in on the semi-spooky history of the town. Pinkerton Dock, the park where some witches had been burned, the old gallows by the courthouse, the Rikers Hotel, they all had a history of ghosts and spooky occurrences. Sometimes, we would just walk around in our dark clothes and heavy makeup, adding to the ambience. So, when the posters appeared at our favorite coffee shop, Dark Brew, announcing a Halloween concert for the local band Burning Ramses, we all planned to be there. We were sitting towards the back, the air heavy with the smell of clove cigarettes and the fruity smell of smuggled vodka, when the man in the vest suddenly approached our table. I was sitting with Catherine and Margot, Tobias and Clyde sitting on the other side, and we had just started discussing what we would do after the concert. Clyde thought that we should go to the old Leaback place, the most haunted spot in town, and see if we could spot some ghosts. Margot wanted to go drinking at Pinehurst Cemetery, something that was a shock to no one. Margot was already 3 sheets to the wind and seemed to be destined for a life of barely functional alcoholism. Tobias was just suggesting that maybe we could check out the trail on the next town over where those kids had been murdered back in the 80s, when the guy seemed to appear between he and Catherine before speaking up. It wouldn't have been so strange. The place was packed, but Kat and Tobias were sitting against the back wall. If you guys are looking for something spooky to do, you should come out to Habersham Cemetery with me. We all jumped and looked at him, clearly startled by his sudden appearance. He was older than we were, somewhere between 20 and 30, wearing dark jeans and a leather vest covered in patches from shows he'd been to. I didn't recognize any of the patches, but I thought I recognized the man. I'd seen him at shows before, one of those guys who likes to hover around the back, and the left side of his head had a weird burn on it, like someone had pressed his face against a radiator. That side was hairless, and he had swooped the rest of his corn silk hair over it to hide the spot. It drew more attention to it, ruining the attempt to hide it, and the longer I looked at him, the more he looked like a skeleton someone had squeezed into scene kid clothes. Hearing him talk now was a little odd. I had expected his voice to be something like a hiss or carry a stutter. We would all be surprised later that we hadn't just told him to leave, which would stick with me. We had been enchanted by him, held by some kind of glamour, and when Tobias asked what he meant, it seemed like he had only been waiting for someone to ask. Habersham Cemetery is supposed to be as old as the town itself. It's lost in the woods near Terry Mill, and I watched a corpse dance there last year. I leaned in to hear, wanting him to go on, but he stood up and pointed at the door with his thumb. I could tell you all about it, but why tell you when I can show you? It happens at midnight on Halloween night, and if I want to see it, I need to get moving. You can come with me if you want. It's definitely something to see. He pushed past Catherine and headed for the door, clearly not caring if we followed him or not, and the 5 of us looked at each other in silent conference. It sounded fun, but none of us knew this guy. Clyde thought his name might be Steve, but he had never talked to him. Clyde was interested in seeing what was at the cemetery, and Tobias thought he had heard of the place before. It's supposed to be wild, like it feels like there might be real magic there, I heard. After a short discussion, it was unanimously decided that we would follow him out there. Catherine added that there were 5 of us, and even if he was a creep, he didn't look very intimidating. The man was a scarecrow, and 5 older teens could easily jump him if he decided to get weird. So after we roused Margot and got her shakily to her feet, we all set out after the weird guy before he could get too far ahead. He looked up when we walked out, enjoying a cigarette on the sidewalk, and his smile was broad and genuine. "Glad you guys decided to join me. Looks like I might need a ride." He pointed to an empty parking spot nearby and explained how his van had been towed while he was inside. "Guess my tags were a little more expired than I thought. Think I could catch a ride with you guys? I don't mind hitchhiking back if you don't want to come back with me." This elicited a new huddle. I had a Ford Focus that would be lucky to hold 4 people, and Kat and Margot had ridden with me. Luckily, Clyde had a Jeep and figured he could easily put all 6 of us in the vehicle. We decided that Tobias and Catherine would sit on either side of this guy in the back, just to make sure he didn't try anything weird. Tobias was a softy, but he was nearly 6 feet tall, and was muscled through the shoulders from working on his dad's farm all his life. Catherine was a waif by comparison, but the whole group had seen her put guys twice her size on their asses more than once, and we felt confident that the 2 of them could keep the guy from getting too crazy. Nodding, we broke and told him he could ride in the back, as long as he could give us directions. He introduced himself as Steve, and took his seat graciously before telling Clyde to hop on the main road and head out of town. We rode in silence past the town sign, the silence getting awkward until Tobias finally couldn't take it anymore. "So, I don't think I've ever been to Habersham Cemetery. What's the deal with it?" "Habersham Cemetery is beautiful, but it's been kinda lost to time," Steve explained. "It's owned by the old Habersham family, though they're all gone now. They were dancers. Did you know that? Their whole family was in the ballet or the theater, until one day their bloodline just kinda dwindled out. The old cemetery is really the only sign that they were ever here at all. When I was in school, my friends and I would go out there to hang out a lot. My friend Trevor had discovered it as a kid, and we used to get drunk and smoke there whenever we all got together. It sounds weird, but that's where I got my first kiss, where I took my first drink, and the place I have the happiest memories of." "Why aren't these friends going out there with you then?" asked Kat, her tone not really accusing, but more curious than anything. "Oh, they just don't really hang out with me anymore. People get older, they kinda drift apart. Life happens and people grow separate. You guys will figure that out one day." At the time, I remember thinking this wouldn't happen to us, but everyone knows how that usually works out. For the moment, we were on an adventure, and that was what was important. Steve bumped Clyde's headrest softly, pointing towards an access road as it swam into the headlights, and he told him to take it. "It's at the end of the access road. It should only take about 10 minutes to get there from here." I checked my watch and saw that it was pushing 11. We should make it in plenty of time, but I hope this wasn't just a creative means to lure us out into the woods. This guy seemed at ease as he sat between Catherine and Tobias, but some people could turn on a dime like that. He could be as quiet as a mouse until he transformed into a lion and stabbed us all to death out there in the woods. The trees slid by in the soupy glass of Clyde's windshield, and as we came to the cul-de-sac at the end of the access road, Clyde slowed down and stopped in the middle. The area was open, carved out and rolled smooth as they prepared to raise new houses here. At the moment, the pristine land just looked barren and lonely, and Clyde looked back at Steve to make sure this was the place. "It's in the woods behind this. Come on," he said, looking at his 2 bookends to see who would get out first. As it happened, Tobias climbed out first, and Steve followed him as Clyde turned off the Jeep and killed the headlights. It was dark, the moon little more than a silvery thought, but luckily Clyde had some flashlights in the back. Steve had his own headlamp in his back pocket, and as we dug out the lights, he slid it on and waited for us to get ready. Margot had sobered up a little and was complaining about how she didn't want to go tromping out into the woods at night. We debated just leaving her there, but as Clyde slid an arm around her, she perked up and prepared to walk into the trees with him. Margot had a pretty obvious crush on Clyde, but she seemed the only one who hadn't guessed that Tobias would be more up Steve's alley. The only one who might have been more surprised to learn that was Clyde himself. Steve headed off into the woods as we checked our lights, his headlamp bobbing between the scrubby trees surrounded by flat and unnatural landscape. He called back to us, telling us to get the lead out if we wanted to see it, and we came along with our flashlights bobbing and Margot swaying as Clyde tried manfully to keep her upright. The night sounds around us seemed way louder than they had been in the city. The crickets chirped and reed happily. The bats tittered and flapped overhead. The frogs sounded off in the depths of the woods, and as the wind rustled, it sounded like the trees themselves were welcoming us. The leaves of last year rattled skeletally on the branches as they chimed in the winter, and the deeper we went, the more lonely the place seemed. It felt like we had entered the graveyard long before I saw the crumbling stone and iron walls that surrounded it. "Welcome to Habersham Cemetery," Steve said grandly. "Here lies the entirety of the Habersham line, save for the last 2 generations who are buried in Mount Christos. I've spent some of the best times of my life here, times I'll never recapture again." He checked his watch and beckoned us inside. Someone had set up a couch under the overhang of trees, and I had a sneaking suspicion I knew who it was. Margot flopped onto the old couch, sending up a cloud of dust and dead leaves, and Tobias sat gingerly beside her as he tested the old couch for bugs or rats. Clyde leaned against a gravestone, and Kat hopped up on a stone marker that was as big as a coffee table. Steve was looking out towards the middle, an area without markers that seemed marred by a few hasty little hillocks. I wondered again if this was the place he meant to kill us, maybe bury us in this long-forgotten graveyard. I doubted it, but it was a thought that wouldn't quite leave. I pushed it aside and went to stand near him, curious about why he had us all here in the first place. "Your van didn't really get towed, did it?" I asked. I expected he would lie, but he surprised me with his candor. "I wasn't as smooth with that one as I thought, was I?" "No, truth is, I usually ask someone to take me out here. Sometimes it's a friend, sometimes it's a stranger, and sometimes I just end up walking. Make no mistake, though, I end up at this cemetery before midnight every year." "And how many Halloweens has that been?" He seemed to consider, but I didn't think he really had to think too hard about it. "About 11. I think maybe this one might be number 12. "And why is this so important that you walk here every Halloween?" I had gotten past the idea that he meant to kill us, but I was still curious about the locale and the reason for coming here. Surely we weren't going to see corpses dance out here. "Well, I think I got time for a story. You see, I used to come out here when I was in middle school with my friends. Davy had found the place, and when he showed Heather, Mark, and I, we thought it was about the coolest place ever. We brought Sandra out here when she and Mark met in high school. By that point, it was our regular hangout spot. We used to come out here every Halloween and tell scary stories and eat candy, drink beer, just relax, you know. I had my first time on that grave marker your friend's sitting on, and afterwards I looked at Heather and knew that she was the only girl I ever wanted to be with." He looked wistfully at the old hillocks, and I realized that there were 4 of them out there. The thought piqued my curiosity, but it also rekindled a little of my mistrust. "Then one night, I messed it all up." An alarm went off on his watch, and he looked down as he wrung his hands. "Any minute now." He watched the mounds in the middle of the boneyard, continuing his story as he waited for the show to begin. "We were coming back from a show one night, all of us drunk or stoned or some combination of the two. A deer ran out in front of my van, and I swerved to miss it. The van skidded, and I went off into the ravine. It wasn't very deep, but I think I was the only one wearing a seatbelt. My friends bounced around in the van like popcorn. When we came to rest at the bottom, I slipped off for a while. When I came to, 3 of them were already dead. I sometimes wish that Heather had been one of them, but it did mean that I got to say goodbye." I heard something rustle out in the graveyard and looked at the 4 mounds that Steve was marking so attentively. "I had a burn on the side of my face from something. I was never quite sure what, but it was bad enough that I'd never forget it. As bad as it was, though, Heather was worse. She was beaten all to hell, laying on what would have been the ceiling and pulling in breath like she had broken ribs and they were in her lungs. She was looking at me, and when I saw her, I unclipped my seatbelt and fell to my knees beside her. Despite her protest, I pulled her onto my lap, and as she lay dying in my arms, I could hear her whispering something again and again. I leaned in close, just as the blue and white lights reflected inside the van, as she whispered her request one final time before passing on." I hardly heard him as he laid it all out. The earth around the mounds had begun to shift, the earth running in rivulets. A dark finger had wormed its way from the closest grave, and an arm was inching out to join it. The top of a head appeared from the ground, and the blonde hair was ragged like old yarn. Steve grinned as he looked at the face below the hair, sniffling a little as She pulled herself free, revealing a corpse in a black dress. The other three wore formal wear, suits or dresses that looked like they'd never seen more than a week above ground. I took a step away, feeling like someone stuck in a George Romero film as I watched them shuffle out like sleepwalkers. "What in the hell?" I asked, and I heard Kat squeak in uncharacteristic fear as she nearly tumbled off the marker stone. Clyde had taken a step towards me, Margot clutching at his arm as she screamed like a fire alarm. Clyde was clutching at something as Margot clutched at him, and I could see that it was a jagged piece of gravestone. Steve stepped in front of him, waving his arms as he begged for him not to hurt them. "They won't hurt anybody. They've never hurt anybody. Just watch." As if they had only been waiting for him to speak, all four took up poses and began to rotate in a slow circle. They moved to a tune that only they could hear, and they turned and moved like dancers caught in a familiar bit of choreography. They were helpless, moved by something unearthly, and their dance had turned into something grotesque as I noticed their injuries. Their clothes hid the bones that must be poking through their skin, but I could clearly see that one of the boys, a big blonde one with football player shoulders, had a broken leg that he was dancing on heedlessly. One of the girls had a head that looked mushy, and the one that I had first seen come out of the ground had a bob to her neck that made it seem like it no longer wanted to support her. The four moved with graceless precision, spinning as they moved in a circle, grasping hands as they came together in the center. "What the hell is this?" Tobias asked, sounding angry as he got off the couch and walked towards Steve. "Dancing corpses, just as I told you." "Yeah, but we didn't expect to actually see them. We thought, Clyde stammered. "Thought what? That I was putting you on? That I was messing with a group of kids? That I meant to drag you out here so I could kill you or rob you? Then why did you come out here at all? Why would you come out here with a complete stranger if you didn't believe what I was saying?" We couldn't really argue with that. He was right. We'd gone into the woods with a perfect stranger. And for what? Had any of us really believed that we would see dancing corpses? We knew that such things didn't really happen, but here we were, watching four rotting corpses dance like tired ballet performers. Clyde went back to the couch, Margot clutching his arm, and we all sat in rapture as we watched their performance. As they turned and moved, I could see that Steve had eyes only for the blonde with the broken neck. He followed her as she spun, smiling whenever her eyes happened upon his. It was hard not to imagine that her rotten lips twisted a little in pleasure, and I felt like I already knew who she was before I asked. "Heather?" I asked, but he put a hand up to stop me. After the dance is over. I'll finish the story then, but for now, just let me watch." I nodded and turned back to see the corpses leaping like deer, their legs groaning in agony as their bones tried to hold them up. Suddenly there were others in the old boneyard, alabaster spirits, their bodies too decomposed to rise and dance, spun around the shambling dancers. Their movements were expert, their bright leotards and costumes from 1,000 different performances, and they complemented the dancing bodies expertly. The dance was one they knew, a dance they had all danced for generations, and as his watch beeped again, all the dancers suddenly stopped and turned to look at us. It was strange having the eyes of the living dead on you, and as they all bowed politely, the ghosts dissipated in a shower of stars. The four corpses, however, simply fell to the ground and moved no more. "Shame it only lasts 15 minutes, Steve sighed. "Okay, I waited till the end of the dance. Now, how about you fill me in on the rest?" I said, my curiosity getting the better of me. "Sure, but first I need to put my old friends back to bed." He went into the woods and came back with 4 shovels. "It'll go faster if you help me, but I understand if you'd rather not." I took the offered shovel, and Clyde reached for one as well. Tobias took some coaxing, but he finally grabbed the other when Catherine sighed and went to take it. Margot just sat on the couch, her eyes closed and her breathing gentle. Clyde told us that it had all been a little too much for her, and he'd watched her faint just as the dead people started to dance. Kat came over to help us anyway, and as we worked, Steve finished his story, bringing the others to speed before continuing. "Heather said she wanted to be buried here, but it wasn't the first time she'd asked it. We were in the graveyard on the last Halloween of her life, watching the ghosts dance and twirl, when she asked me to bury her here when she died. I looked at her oddly, asking why she would want to be buried here, and she told me that she liked the idea of dancing with all the ghosts once a year. Coming back once a year to dance with all my friends sounds like a wonderful way to spend my death. The others must have heard her because they decided they wanted to be buried here too. By the end of the night, all of us had made a pact. We would all make sure that we were buried here, the last one alive making sure that the rest were buried here, one way or another. He rubbed the sweat off his forehead, climbing out of the hole as he prepared to put his friend back in it. None of them thought they'd have to make good on that pact less than a year later. No teenager who's barely in their senior year thinks about their death as more than a distant idea. And suddenly it fell to me to make sure their wishes were honored. Their parents wouldn't hear a word I had to say. They blamed me for their children's death. I was drunk when we crashed after all, and I was barred from their funerals. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew that if I ever wanted to see Heather again, I would need to fulfill my promise to them. You didn't, I said, kind of wishing I hadn't asked. Fortunately, they were buried in 2 different cemeteries. If I'd spent 12 hours in one, someone would have likely caught me for sure. Heather came first, then Mark. Then I got Davy and Sandra from the Presbyterian church, just as the sun came up. I had borrowed my dad's old truck and parked right around where your friend parked his Jeep. I brought them out here one at a time and buried them in the place they loved so much. I put them to rest where I knew they could rest easy, and when it was all done, I washed the evidence out of my dad's truck and parked it right where he had left it. The police came to question me, of course, but I was careful not to let anyone see me enter or leave the cemetery, or leave any evidence behind. In the end, they had to let me go, and I marked the days until Halloween. He lifted Heather into his arms, looking at her rotting face with love. The first time I saw her dance, I was nearly scared shitless. I was out here drinking, keeping up the traditions that we had always held, but I don't think I actually thought they would dance. They weren't Habershams, and I would see nothing but the usual spooks as they capered. When they all drugged themselves up, I spilled my beer and thought they'd come to get me for disturbing their graves. When they began to dance, though, I was so happy. I felt that happiness falter, though, when I realized what it meant. He laid her in the ground again, and as he began to cover her with soil, he looked back with the saddest smile I'd ever seen. It meant that there was no one to lay me to rest in the cemetery when my time comes. I'll never dance with her, never be with her again, unless I have the courage to bury myself alive when the time comes. We were all gathered around the last grave, all of us besides Margot, and as he came out of the hole, he thanked us for helping him. Normally I'd offer you a beer, but I'm afraid I forgot to buy any this time. Clyde told him he thought it might be time for him to take Margot home, and Tobias said he needed to get home for chores the next day. Clyde had Margot over one shoulder, still snoring happily, and I saw Kat slide her hand into Tobias's as they left. I asked Steve if he needed a ride, but he just shook his head and leaned on his shovel. I think I'll stay for a little while. I prefer to spend Halloween with my friends, and I think we've got some catching up to do. We saw Steve a few more times over the years, and unfortunately his predictions had been true. Tobias and Catherine dated until college, when they both got accepted into separate schools. Clyde and Margot were an item for a while, mostly to get his strictly religious parents off his back, until he finally came out and moved to the Midwest somewhere with his secret boyfriend. I got tired of being used as a shoulder to cry on by Margot, and decided to go to college in the next state. I kept in touch with all of them, but we were never together again the way we were in high school. 10 years after I'd seen the dancing ghosts, I happened to be home for Halloween. I decided it might be nice to see them again. Maybe I wanted to prove that I'd actually seen it the first time. Maybe I just wanted to make sure the old place was still there. Maybe I just wanted to see Steve again. Whatever the reason, I found myself pulling up into the cul-de-sac about 11 o'clock that night, locking my car and walking into the woods. The area had grown back up. The lots had been cleared and never used. I had thought it might be hard to find a second time, but the trees looked exactly the same as I remembered them. When the gates loomed up, I saw they hadn't changed either, and I could already see the sagging old couch as it sat beside the fence. I expected that Steve would come wandering up at any minute, but as the time ticked closer to midnight, I figured this would be one performance he would miss. As I sat on the couch, my watch chimed midnight, and the earth began to stir. The original 4 corpses were still there, but they were mostly skeletons now. Their bones were broken and cracked, but they still danced as they had on that night a decade ago. They groaned and creaked as they danced and spun, but the corpse who crawled out of Heather's grave looked a little fresher. He was wearing the same black vest I'd seen him in that night, and though dirty, I could still make out some of the band patches. The ghosts joined them, and I marveled once again at the intricate dance they moved within. I didn't know how long he had been there, but it appeared that Steve had found the courage he was talking about to chase the woman he loved. When they flopped to the ground, I got up and found the shovels again. It appeared they would need someone else to lay them to rest this year. I wondered who would put them in the ground next year, or whether they would simply bake in the sun the day after their performance. I think maybe that was when I decided it was time to move back home. I could do worse than teach English in my old high school, drink coffee at the old coffee shop, and watch the corpses dance on Halloween. Who knows, maybe I'll even find some teenagers to invite out here one night, so they can have something to remember when their high school days are behind them. Maybe they too will come back to see one last performance by the Habersham dancers, +5. What in the hell are those? Clarence had gone to Reggie's Veggies to buy seeds, just as he had every year since Reggie had opened. David Decker probably bought his seeds here too, Clarence reflected. It was part of the reason that Clarence kept coming back. The fact that Reggie was a friend since boyhood, and Clarence taking his business to a new feed store up the road would hurt his feelings, was secondary. Clarence wanted to beat David, wanted to beat him so bad he could taste it. David was a bit of a local celebrity, a legend in the agricultural community, and he'd grown the biggest pumpkins in the county for the last 5 years running. For the last 5 years, Clarence had been content with second place, but he felt that this year was different somehow. This was the year that he beat David Decker and took his rightful place as the biggest pumpkin grower in the county. This year was also different because Reggie said he had something special for Clarence. He had what he called a secret weapon, and he assured him that it would finally wipe the smile off old Decker's face. Reggie had no reason to dislike Decker. He was probably one of Reggie's best customers after all. But the old man had been getting cocky lately, and his bravado had turned the humble produce seller's stomach. Clarence picked up the packet and looked at it. It was just a normal pack of seeds, maybe a little old and crumpled, but clearly just seeds. Reggie had found them in a trunk that had belonged to his grandfather, and they had looked eldritch on the semi-modern countertop. The paper had taken on that soft, velvety feel of a material that has seen the fall of the Second World War, and the seeds inside felt like hard little bullets under Clarence's thumb. The paper declared them to be Blutkürbisser, and everything on the package was in a foreign language. He would have sworn it was something that Reggie had bought from a joke shop, if he wasn't so serious. To be sure, Reggie was a practical joker, but his face was stone-cold serious as he looked at him from across the counter of his vegetable stand. "Blood pumpkins," Clarence said skeptically. "Blood pumpkins," Reggie intoned, back with deep seriousness. "I don't know, Reggie. These things look older than God. You sure they'll grow?" "Absolutely," Reggie stretched the word into 3. "Granddad bought 'em back when he was in Germany. He said the pumpkins he saw over there were huge." Clarence scoffed. "Your granddad was a sodbuster, just like mine, Reggie. When did he go to Germany?" "During the war, same as your granddad, except your granddad spent it in Alaska." Clarence wanted to take offense to that, but Reggie was right. Granddad had gotten a very cushy post, while Reggie's granddad had gotten half his leg blown off by a potato masher and was sent home with honors. Reggie's granddad had used the payout from the government to buy the building where the feed store now sat, while Clarence's grandfather had used his payout to buy the land where his farm was. Just because Reggie Sr. had been a drunk who had squandered the family business was no fault of his. Let me get my usual spread of regular pumpkins too, Reggie, just to be safe. So, how do these work anyway? Any special instructions for these German pumpkins? Granddad always said that the man who gave him the seeds said that a sacrifice was required to see them reach their full potential. What that sacrifice was, the man wouldn't say. Granddad figured if anyone knew anything about sacrifices, it'd be farmers, like you and me. Reggie wasn't wrong. All farming was one sacrifice after another. Farmers sacrificed their time, their love, their family, their hair, and damn near everything else so they could afford to keep the taxes paid and the lights on year after year. Sod bustin' was nothing but sacrifice in many ways, and Clarence figured he'd plant the seeds and see what came of them. He honestly figured he'd get more out of the other packs of seeds than these old pumpkin bullets anyway. He would look back on that moment and reflect that he had known nothing of sacrifice. The seeds went into the ground in the east field, just like generations of pumpkins had before them. As he stood up and rubbed the dirt from his hands, he looked across the field he had nurtured and felt the same sense of pride he always did. Corn was coming up, potatoes and yams, beans and peanuts. The fruit trees were filling the orchard with their sweet scent, and now the pumpkins would be the crowning jewel of his farm. The July sun beat down on him, and he shaded his eyes as he surveyed his kingdom. Clarence knew it wouldn't be long before harvest time. Soon the fields would be filled with the sounds of picking and packing, and it would be time to take another load down to Reggie's so he could sell his wares. Clarence could lay enough back to make it through the winter, and maybe even a little more for the inevitable repairs to the barn or the house, maybe for some expansion next year when the taxes came in. And, he reflected, once he won this year's grand prize for biggest pumpkin, Clarence could open up his own stall the following spring and sell his own wares, just like his father used to. It was a great plan, and now it was time to see if it could bear fruit. Pumpkins grew pretty quickly, as pumpkins do, but after a month, Clarence had 3 that he believed would be real contenders. He had named them, as he did every year, and the names he had chosen were no less grand than the pumpkins themselves. Hercules, Goliath, and Samson dwarfed their fellows by quite a bit, and it seemed that they would be the entries this year. Some people thought it was silly to name a pumpkin, but Clarence always named the ones he thought would be entries in the fair. The other 40 or so would be sold to pie makers, pumpkin carvers, and all sorts of other folks, but these 3 would be weighed, judged, and then made into pies by Mrs. Clarence for the pie contest to be held 2 days hence. He always laughed about it, but Clarence always felt a little sorry to see her make those pumpkins into pies after he'd worked so hard raising them. On the other hand, the blood pumpkin had sprouted only a single offering. Clarence had named him Fritz and set him apart from the rest. So far, it was underperforming, and Clarence didn't think it would amount to much. Fritz wasn't even as big as most of his regular pumpkins, but he kept tending it in hopes that maybe Fritz was just a late bloomer. He'd been surprised when he'd gotten a pumpkin at all from the seeds, and Clarence had held out hope that maybe Reggie's granddad was right about those pumpkins that would be bigger than the regular ones. He pruned it and weeded it by hand, just as he did with the other 3, in the hopes that maybe it would grow bigger and he could sell it as an oddity at Reggie's stand. While his other pumpkins were orange, this one was a deeper orange, like a blood orange, and its leaves had a strange, wilted look to them. Clarence was certain that it would make someone an extra creepy jack-o'-lantern when Halloween rolled around, but he really didn't have high hopes for the stunted little thing other than that. Then, one morning, after caring for it for the past 4 weeks, Clarence was in for a surprise. A painful surprise. Clarence was out tending to the pumpkins, tracking their growth as he nurtured them. His top 3 were still larger and fuller than the others, and Goliath was quickly showing himself to be the front-runner for this year's contest winner. He was pruning around Fritz, his mind wandering, when the shears caught the edge of his index finger. It wasn't a deep cut, but like any wound, it bled a little bit. Clarence snatched his finger back and put it in his mouth, but not before a few drops of blood splattered on the earth around the pumpkin. He didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a cut, and he slid the bandana out of his pocket and held it to the wound. He waited for the bleeding to stop and then got back to work. He didn't think anything about it until the next day, when he went to go check on the pumpkins. Clarence noticed something odd had happened. It wasn't substantial. The pumpkin hadn't grown giant overnight, but the blood pumpkin had grown. The day before, it had been no bigger than a craft store decoration, but now it bulged from the ground like a blood-red tumor. Overnight, it had become larger than Samson, the smallest of his entries for the fair. Clarence scratched his head as he took in the anomaly, getting knee-bound so he could take a better look at Fritz. He had done nothing different besides giving it his blood. Then he remembered what Reggie had said. The plant required a sacrifice. The pumpkin needed something more than water and sunlight to thrive, and Clarence suddenly wondered how big Fritz could get. Wasn't the notion of beating Decker worth a little blood? As though in a daze, Clarence pulled out his buck knife and slid the blade across the meat of his palm. The sting was little more than an afterthought, and as he squeezed his fingers together, he watched a scarlet stream fall onto the soil beneath the pumpkin. The drops splashed onto the vines as well, a single fat drop splattering the body of the gourd, and as it fell, Clarence could swear he heard it growing. It was a soft, whispery sound, like the trees in a light wind, and as the ground drank his blood, it left nothing behind. It grew before his eyes, looking bigger than it had a minute ago. Clarence wrapped the same bandana around his hand and got back to work. The pumpkins required a lot of TLC, but it would all be worth it once he wiped the smile off of David Decker's face. When he returned the next day, Fritz had grown 3 inches overnight. For the next 2 weeks, Clarence made a splash of his blood a regular part of the pumpkin's diet. It was never much, the amount you'd get from a diabetes test, but in 2 weeks, he noticed a change in the size of the blood pumpkin. It grew as big as any of the pumpkins Clarence had planned to enter, overshadowing Goliath by a large margin. By the last week of August, Fritz was the clear entry for the fair this year. The sight of Fritz filled Clarence with pride, but it also made his finger itch. Anyone who cared to look would have seen the bruises on his fingertips and palms. Mrs. Clarence had certainly made a lot of them as she doctored them at the dining room table, but she was the only one so far. The farm had a lot of visitors in the last week of August, to his surprise, and it seemed that someone had seen his blood pumpkin. It was his neighbor first. He could hardly miss a pumpkin that was nearly 5 feet tall and 4 feet wide. He wondered if he could come and have a look, and Clarence had taken him to the field to see it personally. After that, he was visited every day by curious townfolk wanting to see this miraculous pumpkin. They were never unsupervised, of course. As he spent more and more time with the pumpkin, Clarence was becoming quite protective of it. He began to worry that this was as large as it was going to get, topping out just shy of 5 feet, and he started increasing the amount of blood he gave it. He was back to cutting his palm for the fat red drops he'd gotten before, but even that didn't make it grow. The ground drank, but the whispers never happened. Clarence slept poorly, beginning to neglect his other crops, and Fritz the blood pumpkin became somewhat of an obsession. On the 4th of October, Clarence got the visit he'd been expecting. He called on him early, just a short series of knocks that drug him from the table where he'd been listlessly eating his breakfast. He was dressed in overalls and a blue work shirt, boots with run-down heels after many years of use, and a round-top brown hat that was probably meant to make him look like a cowboy, but just made him look more like a farmer from a John Wayne movie. He hadn't taken the hat off, and just stood grinning on the front porch as though they were the best of friends. "David," Clarence said, hiding his mistrust behind a grin, "what brings you all the way out here this early?" "Well, I'd heard tell that I might have a spot to worry about this year. Seems like you've got a real contender on your hands. Mind if I get a look?" Clarence sniffed, sure that he'd heard all kinds of things. Clarence was sure he'd seen pictures and heard gossip, but in the end, Decker decided that he really wanted to look at this miraculous pumpkin. As sure as Decker was, Clarence was just as sure that he didn't want him to see his blood pumpkin. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe it was mean-spirited, but he felt like it might be something else. Clarence was pretty sure that the pumpkin didn't want Decker to see it. Sorry, David. You want to see my pumpkin, you'll have to wait till the contest. Clarence swung the door closed, the conversation at an end, just like the pleasantries, and found the tip of one of those run-down boots blocking the way. Come on now, just a peek. Hell, you let half the town see it, so what's the harm in letting me have a gander? I said no, David, Clarence said, his voice a little harder than he strictly meant it to be. You can see it in 3 weeks, when it's got a blue ribbon attached to it. He moved his foot then, allowing Clarence to close the door, but when he nodded his head and showed him a big grin, Clarence knew it wasn't a genuine smile like he'd seen before. Suit yourself, then. I'm sure I'll see it in due time. He was right, of course, but seeing would prove to be Decker's undoing. He got his look 3 nights later. Clarence stiffened when he heard the sound of someone cursing softly. He was in bed, his wife snoring peacefully beside him. He had been unable to sleep, his eyes making a map of the dark topography of the ceiling, when he heard the noise from the yard. It could have been the wind, but he knew it wasn't. Clarence felt himself getting out of bed and walking down the hall as he made his way into the kitchen. He moved around the dark table and stood in the screen door as he gazed at the shadowy east field. It was late, midnight by the clock on the stove, and there would have been no way for Clarence to see anyone in the field at all. Standing in the dark kitchen, though, he became very sure that he could see someone walking into the field, carrying something with a long handle. Clarence sleepwalked from the house, silent as a ghost, and though the October wind sent goosebumps up his bare arms, he hardly noticed. As he passed by the woodpile, his hands clambered out to wrap around the old, splintery axe that sat beside the ancient stump. As he approached, Clarence saw the person staring at the pumpkin, staring at Fritz, and in the moonlight, it was easy to see them transfixed by the silhouette of that swollen gourd. They stood stock still, contemplating the next thing they meant to do, and Clarence was less than 30 feet away when they raised the tool and swung it down into the pumpkin with a wet, meaty thunk. Clarence screamed in anguish as he ran, bare feet slapping the earth as he churned up the ground. The person must have heard him, because they turned mid-swing. In the moonlight, Clarence failed to register the round-crowned hat and the face full of white, snarling teeth. In his rage, it didn't matter who it was. He had hurt his pumpkin, and now he would end him. He buried the axe in their chest, blade biting into the wood of the hoe, which they had tried to block the swing with, and as the wood splintered, he saw the blood splash across his undershirt. David Decker looked at him with stunned and unbelieving eyes, but those eyes didn't fill with fear until something wrapped around his ankle. His blood had fallen on the ground between them, and even now, the earth was drinking it greedily. He turned drunkenly, axe still buried in his chest, and as he did, he fell to the ground as the blood began to bubble from his lips. The red fell on the face of that unholy gourd, and Clarence saw it grow and writhe before his very eyes. Its vines twined around him, long stalks wrapping him like the coils of a monstrous snake, and all at once, the earth began to writhe and churn as its roots came up to join its tendrils. In his terror, David struggled. His hands lashed out feebly with the broken hoe as he was dragged beneath the soil. Clarence watched as he disappeared into the earth and seemed to come back to himself as his rival disappeared. He felt his knees unhinge all at once and was knee-bound on the soil. As the roots began to slide over him as well, his mind just slipped away as the shadow of the blood pumpkin fell across him, now 6 or 7 feet tall and 5 or 6 feet wide. He could hear it growing and groaning. It grew with a sound like a thin tree in a high wind, and as Clarence blacked out, he never expected to have another thought on God's green earth besides that last. He thought that maybe he had finally made his sacrifice, and that this pumpkin would take him into the earth as its next meal. It might have been kinder if it had. Clarence woke up in the field with his wife standing over him. The pumpkin, that 7-foot-tall behemoth of orange skin and green vines, towered over them both. His shirt was clean, the ground undisturbed, and all signs pointed to the night's events being just a dream, except for the broken hoe and the ugly little scar on the left side of Fritz where the hoe had bitten into him. David Decker was never seen again. The sheriff found his truck not far from the farm, and he came by one afternoon to ask Clarence some questions. The old sheriff sat at the table as his wife sat out lunch, tipping his cigarette ash into a saucer as Mrs. Clarence shot him dark looks for stinking up her kitchen. He asked all the expected questions. Had they seen him? Had he been here? And did Clarence know anything about his disappearance? Clarence told him no. He told him that he had seen David yesterday, but he had left and gone wherever it was he had returned to. Clarence couldn't very well tell him that one of the pumpkins had eaten Decker up and stay out of the nut house. Sheriff made some notes, but ultimately dumped his ash into the garbage can and took his leave. He said the visit was just a courtesy anyway, and that they wouldn't keep Clarence from his harvest. The harvest that year was tremendous. The blood pumpkin wasn't the only thing that had benefited from David's sacrifice, and the yield that year was so great that Clarence could have bought his own stand without the money from winning the contest. That hardly mattered to him, though. Nothing really mattered at that point. By that time, Clarence didn't care about anything but the pumpkin and keeping it happy. October 15th, 5 days before the contest, he began to notice a change in Fritz. Though still connected to the ground and still 7 feet tall, it was beginning to take on a definite sag. It was waxy looking, possessed of an over-ripeness, and Clarence had serious doubts that it would make it to the fair. The blood would no longer sustain it, and whatever it had gotten from David was gone now. It appeared another sacrifice was required, but Clarence didn't have the strength to catch its food for it. The pumpkin was his obsession, but he just didn't have the resolve to feed his neighbors to it. He was sitting at the kitchen table one morning, trying to figure out what to do, when Providence provided. Though unwilling to lure victims for his monstrous gourd, he couldn't stand the idea that it would be lost so soon. To have come so far and stumbled at the finish line was unthinkable, but to give the pumpkin the sacrifice it desired was equally as barbaric. Clarence had no clue what to do, and even from here, he could see the pumpkin waning. It had grown so large that he could see it from almost any place that overlooked the backyard, and the sight of it was awe-inspiring. Had there ever been such a pumpkin as this? Had anyone ever grown a pumpkin so grand? And now, he was just going to let it die. He was weighing his options when the knock came at the door. Clarence shuffled numbly to the door, and to his surprise, he found Reggie standing on the front porch, wiping sweat from his brow and smiling hugely. Reggie, the only one left in town who hadn't come to see the pumpkin. "Thought it was time that I came for a look. They say in town that this pumpkin's something to see." Clarence nodded, a wad of cotton resting in his throat, as an opportunity presented itself before his very eyes. His wife was out visiting a sick friend. The usual crowds had dissipated for now, and this was the first day in weeks he hadn't had to play tour guide. It was just Reggie and Clarence, and he wanted to see the pumpkin, the one he'd heard so much about around the stand. Reggie had walked from his farm a few blocks away. He'd probably told no one where he was going. Clarence offered him a glass of tea as he walked through the kitchen, and then he took him to the east field so he could marvel at the pumpkin. As he gawped in disbelief, Clarence slipped his hand into his pocket. "This is wild. Granddad said they were big, but this is huge." Clarence wrapped a hand around the buck knife he'd used to feed it his own blood. Even if Decker hadn't disappeared, I'm pretty sure that even he couldn't have grown something this big. Reggie had his back to him, and he didn't see the knife slide out. "What have you been feeding this thing? Granddad said it took a sacrifice, but you must have spent a lot of time out here." He was so lost in his own ramblings, he didn't hear the metallic click as the knife came open. "Unless you've been making actual sacrifices out here in the East Field," he said, jokingly. "What's your secret, buddy? Virgin blood? Goat's blood? A little full moon?" He stopped talking when the knife slipped into the side of his neck, stopped talking, and started gurgling. The ground accepted him, and when his wife got home from her friend's house, the pumpkin was 12 feet tall. A week later, the judges came to Clarence's house to see Fritz the behemoth. Clarence won the contest, hands down. It wasn't even a contest. The judges couldn't find a pumpkin even half as large as this, and when Mrs. Clarence came for her yearly sacrifice for the pie contest, he gave her the other 3 instead. She seemed disappointed. Perhaps she had noticed what a mania this pumpkin had become for her husband, but she took them anyway and won the pie contest that year with the tastiest pie the judges had ever had. As she left the field, her arms laden with pumpkins, Clarence first heard the slithery voice of the serpent as it offered its apple. The voice was autumn wind and winter promises, but he had heard it before, hadn't he? It was the voice that tells the farmer he can squeeze one more crop before the winter. The voice that tells the prideful that it won't be that cold tonight, so there's no need to bring the livestock in. It's the voice of creeping winter that hungers for its sacrifice. The voice told Clarence that if it gave the field his wife, his fame would be eternal. On that day, Clarence turned away from it. On that day, he was strong. The sounds of laughing children and swaying scarecrows filled the air as the plastic flags snapped in the breeze. The annual pumpkin patch was something that Clarence looked forward to with great anticipation, and this year he had a prize-winning pumpkin to display amongst the others. He had always played second fiddle to David Decker and his pumpkin patch, but this year, Clarence was the star of the show. It appeared there was a new local celebrity, though Clarence suspected that it was the gargantuan that sat behind the little fence in the patch that people had come to see. Clarence had arrayed the smaller pumpkins for sale, and even Hercules sat amongst them since he'd been spared the pie. The people milled about the patch, looking in awe at Fritz the behemoth as they made their choices. Clarence was at the card table where they sat the cash box, his wife playing the dutiful hostess out in the fields. From his vantage point behind the table, Clarence saw the kid when he stepped a little too close to the massive pumpkin. He wanted to say something to him, tell the kid to back up, but he hesitated as he watched him waddle closer. Look at the kid. He was a porker. He was a hefty kid from a family of hefty adults, and he had stopped to stare at the pumpkin as he held one of his smaller cousins in his pudgy hand. All at once, he shifted the pumpkin under his arm and stepped towards the monstrous gourd with a hand outstretched to touch. Clarence wanted to say something, should have stopped the kid before he could get any closer, but as Clarence started to raise his voice to warn him, he heard the voice of the serpent again, asking him to stand aside, commanding him to stand aside. The mustached man cleared his throat at Clarence, and Clarence sat back down. He reached for the man's money, his eyes straying to the boy as he laid one fat pink starfish hand against the red skin of the monster. He cast his eyes away, but even that didn't save him from witnessing the end. The kid went into the ground without a sound, and when the pumpkin shattered on the ground next to the gargantuan one, no one was the wiser. The police were called when the absence was noticed, and they searched the field and the forest beyond for weeks without finding a thing. The boy's parents sat at the kitchen table, his mother crying into a square of silk as Clarence's wife poured tea and assured her he'd turn up. She had kept right on assuring her of that until 10 o'clock that night. Clarence was lucky his wife was such a hostess, because all he could do was sit, shell-shocked in a chair, as she puttered around and made small talk. Everyone thought he was broken up about the kid, and in a way, they were right. After all, it's not every day you watch a kid get pulled into the soil while no one's looking. Clarence saw the flashlight lights from the inside of the tent as the fair raged outside. They had given him his own circus tent to draw in the crowd, and Clarence had no lack of people wanting to see the pumpkin. It wasn't every day you got to see a 20-foot-tall pumpkin, and he'd been making the circuit for the better part of 4 months. People were always amazed that the pumpkin stayed so fresh, so alive, but Clarence knew the reason. The best fertilizer always seemed to walk through the flap of his tent, didn't it? He won the contest the year after the kid had disappeared, too. People said he had a knack for growing pumpkins, but really, it was the same one. When it got 18 feet tall and 12 feet wide, it started to attract tourists from some of the local hollers. Some of them never made it back to wherever they had been from either, but the wrecker never asked too many questions when they came to tow their cars. By that point, Clarence was numb to the sacrifice. The pumpkin ate, the pumpkin grew, and as the tourists began to pay to see it, Clarence found that he didn't have to be a farmer anymore. The pumpkin made his farm a natural spot for tourists on the road, and they never grumbled too much about a few dollars here and there to see it. That was how he came to be on the road and in this tent. The man in the suit had offered him a startling amount of money if he'd go on the road with his gourd, and Clarence knew he'd be a fool if he didn't take him up on it. They loaded it up on a flatbed and took it to the county fair after county fair so the whole state could see the world's biggest pumpkin. They did it for 5 years, and in those 5 years, Clarence remembered hearing about a suspected serial killer plaguing the state. They dubbed him the County Fair Kidnapper, and in 5 years he abducted more than 20 children and 5 adults from state fairs across the state. The state police even questioned Clarence, though not as a suspect. They wanted to see if he'd seen anything amiss, and he always told them no. He hardly had a choice, after all. If he'd suddenly told them that his prize-winning pumpkin was eating people at an alarming rate, they'd have slapped him in the loony bin. Clarence knew he wasn't blameless in the whole affair, but the pumpkin was good for his family. The pumpkin was good for the town, after all. In truth, the massive pumpkin in Clarence's east field was the only thing that kept the town from being just another cow-flop Midwestern nothing. The pumpkin brought in the crowds, and the crowds stopped in at the cafe to have a bite. They stopped at the gas station for gas and road snacks. They stopped at the farmer's market to buy fresh produce. They spread their money up and down the street from May till November, and the town always had a corn maze or a fair to draw some of it away from the pumpkin and back into the town proper. At one point, Clarence's face and a picture of the pumpkin were even on the town sign when you drove over the city limits. "Come see the world's biggest pumpkin," it stated, in bold black letters, and at one point, you could damn near see the thing from the city outskirts. In its heyday, it towered nearly 30 feet high and was wider than the farmhouse. By this time, Clarence was blind to its feedings for the most part. Hell, by this point, Clarence was complicit in the murders. He had killed 2 for Fritz already, and was responsible for all the rest as far as he was concerned. He had turned aside, hadn't he? He was content to sit in his lawn chair by the fence and charge people for the opportunity to stand at the base of the giant and feel small in the shadow of a pumpkin. Unfortunately, Clarence had made the same mistake that many men in his position make. He had lived in the shadow of the dragon for so long that he believed he was safe, that his family was safe. It depended on him, after all, and he believed that he and his family were safe from that slithering grasp. Even after 5 years, he didn't really grasp its slyness, its cunning, until it finally took someone that he couldn't turn away from. It happened suddenly, but the horror of it would never leave him, no matter how long he lived. He was standing in the back door, watching her work in the garden. He was trying to ignore the creeping voice as it told him it needed to feed. She was out in the field, tending some vegetables in the space he no longer used, and as he watched her, he began to wonder if he might resist this evil and win free. Clarence had been this pumpkin's puppet for nearly 8 years, 8 long years of dragging its burden around his neck, and his heart was growing heavy with the burden of that sin. As he watched her in her purity and love, he began to think that he might escape this evil thing and be the man he once was. They could leave, just pack their things and go. They could leave this cursed earth behind them as they went out to start anew somewhere else. She'd noticed something was off, likely noticed from the start that something was off, but she was dutiful. She was obedient. She loved him more than he could ever love her. He would never have let her go near that field again if he had. She was coming in, carrying a basket of produce, and he would always remember the way she smiled when she saw him. Her face, that old young face of hers, stretched into a smile as she raised her hand to wave. Clarence had raised his hand to return her wave, had it half cocked, but it died on his wrist when she dropped into the earth. Dropped. That was the right word. She didn't sink. She wasn't pulled. It was as though a hole had opened up and swallowed her in one gulp. Her basket fell, tumbling vegetables across the dirt, and it was all the evidence that existed that she had been there at all. Clarence hitched in his breath as he stared at those rolling vegetables, the scream of rage and pain nearly ripping his throat apart as it rocketed into the world. It laughed at him as he dug up the field. Clarence dug it up in furious, crumping sweeps of the shovel, but he never found a trace of her. He stayed out there digging until well past moonrise, with only Fritz for company. She was the last sacrifice he was a part of. She was the last meat that Fritz didn't have to catch for himself. This was also the last time Clarence tried to square up with that terrible giant. It was black dark when he went inside, and it was past midnight when he stood in the shadow of the pumpkin again. He was drunk, weaving and bleary, and in his hand was a tin holder with a rag in the neck. Clarence had concocted this plan as he crawled head first into a jug of corn whiskey, and it was the best plan that he could think of. The coal oil would burn hot and bright, and when he threw it on the pumpkin, it caught immediately. He sat back and watched as the flames ate the fuel, but the pumpkin did nothing but laugh at his futile efforts. The slithering voice told him that he couldn't kill it that easy. It told him that the two were stuck together now, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. It had been wrong on that last account, or so Clarence hoped. He set up a fence after that, and never let the tourists come close again. They could pay their money, and they could observe from a distance, but no one was allowed to go into the field again. It cawed at him as Clarence sat in the chair by the fence. It said that this was a useless gesture, that it couldn't stop him if he wanted them, but he ignored it. He kept his vigil, kept his silence, and as the two lived, the town shriveled around them. It had gotten too powerful, too evil to be contained, and those who spent time close to it became susceptible to its voice. They came in the night, and they died silently in the field as they were drawn into the earth. The sheriff, the owner of the feed store, the girl who served the coffee at the diner, they all came to the field to give their lives to the gourd. Clarence tried to stop them, but no matter what he tried or how he fought, they all came to the gourd and gave it their life's blood. The town was deserted, a ghost town in a country full of ghost towns, and the only thing to see was Fritz. Fritz, the world's oldest pumpkin. They're both shriveled now, a couple of relics from a bygone age, and those who come to see them usually say how they saw Big Fritz when they were kids. Clarence still keeps his vigil, but the pumpkin's a lot more manageable now. He sits in a glass case, small and red and angry, and those who stand around looking too long always come away with headaches. For $5, you can get your selfie and have a pamphlet on the ninth wonder of the world, but the crowds have mostly gone now. He's a shriveled old thing, small as he was before Clarence gave him his first drop of blood, but if you spend too long in his company, you can hear his creaky old voice. You can start to feel his influence in your head. Spend too much time around him, and one night he might just draw you into the field and begin the cycle anew. Grandpa was born on October 30th, 1945. He and my grandma were the closest thing I had to real parents, and I'm grateful to have had them. My dad was never anything more than a name on a birth certificate, and my mom was in an accident just after I was born. I've lived with my grandparents since I was 8 months old, and I learned so much from them. Grandma taught me to take care of myself, to cook and clean, and how to be responsible for a household. From Granddad, I learned, too many things to list. He taught me to hunt, to fish, to manage my money, to pay my debts, how to be a man. As I said, that's a lot to put on a short description, but Grandpa was a great man. He shared everything with me, the two of us being incredibly close. But I recently found out that he held on to one little secret. The secret to his long life. Something I learned on the day that he died. Grandpa always celebrated his birthday in the same way. He would sit on the porch with Grandma, both of them in costume, and pass out candy to trick-or-treaters. Grandpa loved Halloween, always wore a costume, and bought the best candy for the scores of kids that came to the farm. Grandpa was known for his corn mazes, spooky decorations, and the best candy in town. I've always helped with the festivities throughout my childhood, and despite all the smiling kids and happy adults, Grandpa always had the biggest grin on his face. As the porch lights started going off, and the kids started heading home, Grandma would light the candles, and we would sing to Grandpa as he sat smiling at the small pile of candles smoldering on top of his cake. In the candlelight, his face always seemed more lined and seamed than it normally did. Granddad had looked 40 well into his 60s, but he looked about 100 in the light of all those candles. After he blew them out, Grandma would cut pieces off the double chocolate cake, and Grandpa would savor every bite like it might be his last. I asked him about it once, and he just laughed and said that one day I'd understand. Then he'd check his watch, 9:55 on the dot, and he'd excuse himself to go set up in his music room. Calling it a music room doesn't really capture its grandeur. Grandpa, back in his day, was a country music star of sorts. He played on the Grand Ole Opry, joined the band with the Presley Jamboree, and he'd opened for Johnny Cash in his heyday. The room was full of pictures of him playing with everyone from Merle Haggard to Conway Twitty, and his guitar collection was awe-inspiring. Granddad spent a lot of time there, as I remember, and he often wrote songs for artists and recording companies. He would sit there on his birthday, however, and play the same old guitar every time. It was a battered old acoustic, the lacquered white body peeling and ratty, the strings worn to the point of unraveling, and the neck seemed chipped beyond repair. Despite this, it was one of Grandpa's favorites, and he picked it often when he was alone. Despite this, he always looked so thoughtful when he played, like it reminded him of something he'd rather forget. Grandpa would sit in there and practice for a little while, and then, at exactly 10:30, he would call me in, kiss my forehead, and tell me to get to bed. I would always stay up on Grandpa's birthday, even if I had school the next day. At 10:30, though, I would go to bed, and I would always listen to the music from the room as Grandpa played. When I was little, I just listened from my bed, the words making me feel weird. Granddad's voice was smooth, ageless, and I sometimes thought that it must be a younger man who was singing with Granddad. In the beginning, I did think I heard a second voice, but I always put it aside as my ears playing tricks on me. Well, what is this I can't see with ice cold hands getting hold of me? Well, I am death, none can excel. Open the door to heaven or hell. I was 6 the first time I snuck out to listen to Granddad. I was so scared, not because I was breaking the rules, but because it was so dark in the hallway. Granddad had one of those old character lamps, Woody Woodpecker, I think, and the bulb was old and yellow. It made a little island of light, a reprieve in the darkness, and I had to walk through the darkness with something like real terror creeping up my throat. I didn't want to go, not at first, but the music seemed to pull me. The closer I got to the door, the closer it all became. I could hear Grandpa's voice oozing from beneath the door, and it enticed me right up to the lock. Oh, death, won't you spare me over to another year? I knew there was definitely a second voice singing, something low and gravelly, and it oddly harmonized with Grandpa's silky tones. That old guitar, the one with the bone-white body, jangled on the 4th key as the tuner loosened in that slow, careful way that it does. Even this didn't sound at odds with the song. It all came together like a dying body singing its final notes. Granddad played, the stranger singing harmony with him, and I leaned against the door as I listened to them. Oh, death, someone would pray, could you wait to call me just another day? The children prayed, The preacher preached, time and mercy are out of your reach. I left before the song was over, climbing into bed and covering up as Granddad finished playing and went to bed himself. I never heard his guest leave, just Grandpa sharing a few quiet words before leaving his music room and heading to bed. Even at 6, I knew that was weird, but I didn't think much of it. I was young, and my brain was involved in other matters, like Ninja Turtles and the third Mario game. I guess that was when I started paying attention to Granddad's yearly ritual. I was young, so it was only precursory at best. I noticed Granddad pass out candy, run the yearly carnival, eat his cake, and then retire to his music room. After I'd gone to bed, he would play that song, his strange guest singing along, and I would sit at the door and listen. It was always the same song, the mournful tone that made my skin prickle. The voice singing with him was part of it, I realized. But I didn't know exactly what I was hearing until much later. I just assumed that he had some friend who came over late to celebrate his birthday, with some songs and maybe a few drinks. I'll fix your feet till you can't walk, lock your jaw so you can't talk. Close your eyes so you can't see this very hour. Come and go with me. The way the guitar shivered in his hand as his dexterous fingers rang the sounds from the strings was magical. I'd seen his fingers grow thicker and thicker as the arthritis took the mobility from his hands, but it never seemed to extend to his playing. On nights like tonight, though, it was like having my grandfather play in his 20s again. His nimble fingers playing on the aging guitar were ghostly, and I became more scared of the music than anything in the hallway. I have come to take your soul, leave the body and leave it cold, to drop the flesh from off the frame. Earth and worms will have their claim. I was 12 when I asked him about the strange jam sessions he had. I was eating eggs and grits at the table, the school bus still an hour away, and the yawn that interrupted my eating made Grandpa chuckle as he entered the kitchen. "Stay up too late reading your funny books again?" Grandpa asked, shaking out his newspaper. He'd been awake since the sun's edges graced the sky, and his hands were already gray with soil. Granddad's father had been a farmer, just like his father before him. Granddad had kept the tradition alive, despite not needing to. Granddad hadn't been foolish with his money like some of his contemporaries had been. He had bought land, invested in things that lasted, and now in his old age, he rested on his laurels. "Nah," I said, deciding to ask the question that had been bugging me for years. "I guess I heard you playing last night and just couldn't get to sleep." Grandpa hummed from behind his paper, but I could tell that the question was something he was considering. It was November 1st, and Grandpa had gone through his usual routine last night, complete with jam session. I had lingered outside the door, my hand on the knob as I listened, and I had only just slipped back in my room when he came out. The whole time he played, I had thought about just throwing the door open and seeing who was singing with him, but the idea seemed tantamount to walking in on Gramps while he was in the shower. Plus, hell, there was something about the person singing with him that scared me a little. I couldn't put my finger on it, but that was not a man to be crept up on. "Who do you play with every year, Gramps?" I asked, keeping eye contact with the back of his paper as he hid behind it. "I never see them leave, but I know I've heard them." Grandpa was quiet for a little while, long enough for me to think that he wouldn't answer. "It's an old friend, kiddo." I took a few more bites as I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Grandma put some breakfast down in front of him, and Grandpa folded his paper and began to eat. I watched the eggs and bacon being forked into his mouth, giving him a moment before plunging onward. Grandpa didn't like being prodded, especially when he was eating, but I needed some answers. "So who are they? I've never seen them come in, or even leave after." "You don't need to know. It's none of your business, kiddo, so don't be nosy." My curiosity was piqued, but Grandpa had made it pretty clear that the subject was closed. It wouldn't do any good to argue once his mind was made up either, but that wouldn't stop me from continuing my investigation. I asked Grandma about it, but she wouldn't tell me much either. "It's something your grandpa's done since he was young. He told me after we were married that it was something he had to do once a year and that I couldn't bother him while he was doing it. The consequences would be dire, is all he would say when I asked him why. When I asked her why he did it at night, she told me that Grandpa had said that he was born at night. He was born at 10:46 on Halloween. He says that has something to do with it, but he's never told me more than that, and I've never asked. Your grandfather is a heck of a man, but business is business. You might not like what you find if you go poking around either, kiddo. I didn't fully understand at 12, but it made me hungry to know more. Oh, death, whoa, death, won't you spare me over till another year? I spent the next 10 years crouching outside the door, listening to the song. I'd learned the song. It was an old one, and Grandpa played it better than anyone I'd ever heard. Grandpa played it as though he was busking to buy daily bread. He put his heart and soul into every word, which somehow changed the words. It was something I looked forward to every year, and part of the reason I asked Grandpa to teach me how to play in the first place. My mother came to my bed, placed a cold towel upon my head. My head is warm, my feet are cold, death's a-moving upon my soul. Grandpa was thrilled when I asked him to teach me. I was 13 and I wanted to know how to make music like him. He told me not to get too ahead of myself, but agreed to teach me after school. He was pretty clear that my schooling had to come first, but he was more than happy to teach me the chords and some techniques. We practiced after school every day, Grandpa taking me through the basics with ease. I took to it pretty quick, Grandpa saying I must have gotten the knack from him, and pretty soon I was playing the usual teenage standbys. Grandpa rolled his eyes as I played Wonderwall and Chop Suey, playing along as I powered through Bridge Over Troubled Waters or House of the Rising Sun. Grandpa taught me some of the old shit-kicking tunes he used to cut his teeth on at the honky-tonks, and soon I was playing along with most of what he threw at me. It wasn't until I picked at the first few chords to the song I'd heard him play on his birthday that he covered my hand and stopped me. Not that song, kid. Never play that song. That song is... I only play that song once a year, and never until then. Oh, death, how you treating me. Closed my eyes so I can't see. Well, you're hurting my body, you make me cold. You run my life right out of my soul. Grandpa and I played every chance we got, and as the years proceeded, I found I liked playing music with him. I always played for fun, though. I never made it more than something to impress girls at a bonfire, or wow my friends at the talent show. By 16, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. Music was fun, but I loved discovering how things worked. Machines were my passion, but I loved taking anything apart and discovering how it functioned. Granddad supported my plans to go to college after high school, and for graduation, he presented me with a beautiful acoustic guitar. So you don't forget to have fun while you're working your ass off, kiddo. Oh, death, consider my age. Please don't take me at this stage. My wealth is all at your command. If only you'll move your ice-cold hand. Tonight, Grandpa celebrated his 75th birthday in the same way he always did. He dressed as Old MacDonald, Grandma as Mrs. MacDonald, in a long flowery dress, and they handed out candy to cowboys and aliens and various superheroes. I've been living with them while I attend college, and as the kids left and the floodlights went out for the night, I slid the comically large cow head off and joined my grandparents on the porch. Grandma had a double chocolate cake, alight with 75 burning candles. As we ate our cake, I couldn't help but notice that Grandpa looked a little different tonight. Not sad, but speculative, like this might be the last piece of Grandma's cake he ever ate. When I got up to take my plate to the kitchen, Grandpa put a hand on my arm and asked Grandma if she would mind taking my plate too. She said not a bit, and took all 3 plates to the kitchen so she could wash up. Grandpa looked at me, his face asking the question before his mouth, and it was the question I'd been waiting to hear my whole life. Would you like to come and play with me tonight? I was speechless. How long had I waited for just that very thing? I nodded at him and followed him to the music room with excitement and apprehension. I was finally going to get to meet Grandpa's mysterious guest, the one I'd heard singing for so many years. I remembered the way that touching the doorknob had made me feel, and wondered if I could even play in his presence. Oh, the young, the rich, the poor, all alike to me you know. No wealth, no land, silver or gold, nothing satisfies but your soul. He was waiting for us when we came into the studio. He was, well, there was no way to describe him. He was tall, not height-wise, but more long than tall, I guess. His fingers were especially long, and I wondered if he played guitar too. He was dressed in white, his pristine suit complete with a bolo tie, and his hat was a tall 10-gallon that made him look like a rancher on a western. His face gave me the willies, though. He looked like someone had stretched a very believable flesh mask over a cow skull. The bones in his cheeks poked out oddly. His ears were long and curved in strange ways. His eyes were hollow, like a skull, and looking at him made me a little ill. Who was this guy? How did he know my granddad? He must be important if Granddad would spend his birthday evening with him every year.
Ah, Ramon. Good to see you.
Azzy, Granddad said, taking his guitar off the wall. Long time no see.
365 days to be exact. So you play for me tonight?
Grandpa looked at the guitar, the bone-white body looking odd against his tan skin, and smiled as he walked towards me. Nope, my grandson is. He pushed the guitar into my hand and took a seat beside me. The guitar felt strange, like nothing I'd ever held before. The neck felt porous, almost like driftwood, and the body was coarse against my skin. There was a smell to it, something like moldy wood, and I realized I had never actually played this guitar before. Grandpa played it sometimes, but other than the nights like this, he didn't seem to want to touch it. The stranger looked at me expectantly, and as I strummed the chords, I could only think of one song I wanted to play. The song I had heard so many times spilling out from under that door, spilled from my own mouth like he had gutted me. The words bubbled out as I sang for death's reprieve, for death's abatement, and as I sang, I felt the stranger watching me. Though my call was to death, it felt as if this stranger were the one I was truly singing to. I felt like his eyes were boring into me, seeing my worth, and as the song came to a close, he clapped his hands together in mock good cheer. His hands coming together sounded like bones rattling in a crypt.
Well done, kid. You got chops. Maybe not chops as big as your grandpa here, but chops. Take it this means our deal's at an end, Ramon?
Granddad nodded, reaching for the guitar and nodding to me. Head to bed, kid. Azzy and I have some business to discuss. I told him I'd see him tomorrow, but I doubted him when he said he was sure he would. I wept as I lay in bed, not knowing why. Grandma woke me up the next morning. She was crying, her words slurred as she told me that Grandpa was in his music room. He had passed in the chair that he always sat in when he played music. The doctors said it had been a heart attack, that he likely hadn't suffered. I hadn't needed him to tell me that. When I came across Grandpa in his music room, he had the most satisfied smile on his face. That white guitar was laying across his lap, and when I picked it up, I put it away, the touch of it making my skin crawl. I was kind of numb through the funeral, unable to come to terms with what I'd seen. Had that man, the one that Grandpa had called Azzy, been responsible for his death? How had he given Grandpa a heart attack? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made, but I felt like he had something to do with all of this. Grandpa's note, however, brought it all into perspective. Grandpa left me his music room and his will. All the guitars were mine, all the awards, all the music memorabilia, a binder of songs that he hadn't sold yet. It was a generous gift, given on the grounds that I stay in school and help Grandma keep the house up. The house would be mine after Grandma was gone, but I hoped that would be many years away. I found myself there after the funeral, as my eyes strayed to that strange guitar again, and I wondered how I had missed the note. It was slid under the strings on the neck, and the white paper stood out like a surrender flag. I picked it up, trying not to touch the guitar, and unfolded it to see Grandpa's neat handwriting. "If you're reading this, kid, then I'm gone. The music room's yours, and I hope you'll take good care of the things in it as I did. I've had a long and happy life, kiddo, and it was made better by watching you grow into a fine man. You'll make a fantastic engineer one day, but for now, I want to talk about the music. I've been playing and singing since I could walk, but it wasn't until Azzy saw me at the Bent Spoon one night that I really got my break. I saw him watching me as I played. How could you miss him, even in a crowd? The longer he watched, the more intent on me he became, and after I was finished, he approached me with an offer. He gave me that guitar, a strange one that I sometimes play, the one that feels like rotten wood, and told me to play. He said as long as I played music with it, I'd be successful, have the kind of money that I could only dream of, and have a long and fruitful life. The trade-off, though, was twofold. Once a year, at the time of my birth, I would play that song for him. If I missed a year, then the deal was off, and my life would end. The other part was that, after my death, I would come to his world and play for him for all time. You're a smart kid, like I was a smart kid. You likely realize that Azrael to everyone but me, ain't human. If you take up that guitar and play for him, you can live as I lived. You can be a star. You can live comfortably. But you'll be with him when it's all said and done. I regretted my decisions at leisure, having acted in haste in my youth, but I felt it was time to make good on my deal. I know that when I die, I won't sit at the right hand of God, as it says in those songs I've sung sometimes. I don't know what awaits me, but 75 years is a long time to walk the skin of the earth. I'm tired, kiddo. It seems like a good time to lay my burdens down. I don't know where I'm going, but I hope I don't see you there someday. Tell Melinda I love her, and watch over her until God calls her home. I won't tell you not to take up the guitar, but if you do, I feel like you should know the consequences. I love you, kiddo. Have a great life. Love, Grandpa." That was 5 years ago. Grandma passed away before I graduated college, but I became the engineer that I always wanted to be. I've got a great job. I'm seeing an amazing woman that I mean to propose to next month, and I've made my grandpa's home my own. I still sit in my grandpa's music room sometimes, though, and strum a few chords or play something we played together. The white guitar hasn't moved since I put it on the wall the day that Grandpa died, and I don't intend to ever take it down again. Sometimes, though, I get the itch to pick it up and play it, especially on my birthday at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't think it or its owner will be content with Wonderwall or House of the Rising Sun, though. No, I think it wants something older, something blacker, and I think the bargain will be for something harder to pin down than time or wealth. I may not want to, but I fear that someday I'll take up Grandpa's guitar, and the bargain will be the same as it was for him so many years ago. I fear that one day I'll trade my soul to death so he might spare me over till... Jeffry hated jack-o'-lanterns. This was a problem, since his hometown was known as the jack-o'-lantern capital of the United States. Every year, the town was host to thousands, if not millions, of carved horrors. It had become a point of pride for their Midwestern town. The town had been full of pumpkins since its founding back in the 1800s, and the town was filled with glowing, grinning gourds from September till April. The public commons had 3 large greenhouses that grew pumpkins during the cold months, and no citizen had to pay for one of those pumpkins. Jeffry was pretty sure it came out of their taxes, along with road works and the police force. Jeffry had grown up carving, eating, and hating pumpkins with a red-hot fury. As a child, the glowing gourds had frightened him. His parents were never sure why, but he was terrified of them. Until he was 7, Jeffry had refused to even carve one, and he remembered getting into some trouble several times for pushing them off the porch. It never stopped a new one from appearing where the old one had been, but it always came with a stern talking to about wasting pumpkins. Pumpkins were a hot commodity in the town, and were not something to be squandered. By the time he was 17, his fear had turned into a deep hatred. A hatred that had brought him to this moment. Jeffrey was sitting on the commons with his friends when he got an idea. Hey, what if we pulled a prank on Halloween? Like a big one. Chris looked up, cigarette smoke curling over his face, while Chris leaned over his handlebars and grinned stupidly at Jeffrey. What kind of prank? Chris asked, cigarette hanging from his mouth like a modern-day cowboy. Chris was your typical greasy teenage troublemaker. He was decked out in a leather jacket, ripped jeans, black boots, and a constant need to smoke the cigarettes he usually lifted from his dad. Chris likely considered himself some kind of badass, and Jeffrey had seen him make good on enough of the idle threats he made to agree with him. Despite this, Chris was the most stable of Jeffrey's friends, and he made quite the contrast to the grinning idiot leaning on his handlebars. Something big, something they'll never forget, Jeffrey said, grinning hugely. Jeffrey was watching them unload a wagon of pumpkins from the greenhouse as they loitered on the commons. Jeffrey wanted nothing so much as to watch them all become compost. Like, maybe some soap in the fountain again? Kevin suggested. Kevin was the polar opposite of Chris. If Chris looked like a greaser, Kevin looked like a generic Chad. Blonde hair, blue eyes, tap-out t-shirt, gold chains, wind pants, and lots of pictures on his phone of his well-crafted physique. Kevin and Chris had been Jeffrey's friends for a long time, but the truth was that he mostly just used them as muscle. He wanted them in case things went south, and something like this had the potential to go very wrong very quickly. No, Kevin, something a little bigger this time. I'm thinking about smashing some pumpkins on Halloween night. Kevin grinned, but Chris raised a pierced eyebrow at him. Are you kidding? You know how anal this town is about those damn pumpkins. If we go around people's houses and smash up their jack-o'-lanterns. No, I'm not just talking about the ones on people's houses. I want to smash all the pumpkins. The ones at the houses, the ones at the shops, and the displays on the commons, too. The two of them looked at him in stunned silence. By morning, I don't want a single jack-o'-lantern in the whole town unpulped. Kevin grinned like a shot fox, nodding his head and raising his hand for a high five. Jeffrey obliged him, holding his hand up to Chris next. Chris didn't say anything, though. His lips were slowly creeping into a distinctive evil grin as he thought about the implications, and he slapped his own palm against Jeffrey's at long last. Chris was smart, probably smarter than anyone Jeffrey knew, but he loved a good trick as much as anyone. The idea of all the townspeople seeing their pumpkins smashed, their town pride destroyed, made him feel like the Grinch at the end of the movie, sans the change of heart, of course. We'll be legends, more than legends. We'll be infamous, Chris said as he pulled his hand into a raised fist. Jeffrey laughed. Boys, I guarantee that the day after Halloween will go down in town history when we're done. As they sat on the commons and started to flesh out their plans, Jeffrey had no idea how right he was. They stood in Jeffrey's garage later that day and made plans. Halloween was 5 days away, and they had to make sure that they could commit their prank and get away with it unscathed. Being arrested for a stunt like this would only elevate their street cred, but Jeffrey was honestly a little worried about how the town would take what they were getting ready to do. As the three rode through town to get to Jeffrey's house, they passed through the downtown and saw the shops littered with pumpkins. The plaque that commemorated when the world's largest pumpkin had come through town with the fair one year showed resplendently on the front lawn of the town hall. The display table of pumpkins outside Jack-o'-lantern's museum made the table sag under their orange mass. Jeffrey thought once again how vital the stupid things were to the town. They would get in real trouble for this, so the first order of business would be masks. They'll need to be full face, too, Chris put in when Jeffrey brought it up. I don't want them seeing our hair, our noses, and identifying us somehow. Kevin laughed. Easy. My bro and I are heading to Seaver Friday night. You guys slide me some cash from masks, and I'll bring back some quality stuff. Jeffrey looked at Chris, and he looked back at him. This was a big ask from Kevin, a guy who still got lost on his way to school sometimes. Kevin's role in the gang was muscle, that was obvious, and trusting him with something like this was a stretch. If he got distracted when he and his bro got to Seaver, they could be out of money and have no masks for this caper. Chris was right when he said full face mask would be a must, and the shops in town wouldn't have what they were looking for. Kevin must have noticed the look, because he got a little frustrated. "Oh, come on, guys, I can do this. Do you want good masks or not?" Chris shrugged at Jeffrey, who sighed as he took out his wallet and handed Kevin a 20. Kevin looked at Chris, opening and closing his hand as he crumpled Jeffrey's 20 in his grip. Chris dropped his motorcycle boots off the table and rolled his eyes, pulling out a 20 of his own and adding it to the pile. Kevin reached into his wind pants and took out a 20 of his own, adding it to the pile before pushing the whole wad into his pocket. They were taking a big chance on Kevin, and both made sure he damn well knew it. The next 5 days were agony for Jeffrey. He couldn't tell anyone what they were planning to do. That would ruin the prank, but they still had to make sure they had an alibi. Providence threw them a bone on that one, because their friend Mark was having a Halloween party that night. One RSVP later, and they made the party part of their plans. People would see them, they would remember that they had been there, and Jeffrey and his friends could sneak out at 9:30 and be back home before any of the booze-soaked brains had time to miss them. It was the perfect plan, and promised to give the boys maximum deniability if questioned. Even so, Jeffrey didn't sleep well that week. He was plagued with dreams that he would stagger awake from and fall back into as soon as he closed his eyes. Jeffrey saw himself smashing jack-o'-lantern after jack-o'-lantern, a deep fog surrounding everything as he moved from gourd to gourd. All the while, something watched him from that haze. Jeffrey couldn't see it, but it was big. Its red eyes seemed pleased at what he was doing. Now and again, Jeffrey would raise his bat and salute to the mysterious figure, and it would rear back and cackle like a demon. These dreams terrified him, but Jeffrey always woke up feeling elated at the regard of this creature. The three seemed to plan constantly that week. They would use their bikes as transportation. Jeffrey figured their bikes would cut around with less notice than a car, and they would be faster than on foot. He figured they would have about an hour and a half tops to pull this off before the devastation was noticed, and speed would be critical to the operation. Kevin had some baseball bats in the shed that they planned to use, and the three of them began to map their route. As long as Kevin got the masks, they'd be home free. He winked at them Friday afternoon as his brother came to pick him up from school. "Don't forget," Jeffrey reminded him. "I've got this, guys," Kevin scoffed, hopping into the Jeep as the two peeled out for Seaver. Chris and Jeffrey parted ways then, hoping against hope that they would have the last pieces of the puzzle soon. Chris sent him a text later that night saying, "I still haven't heard from Kevin." Jeffrey sighed as he buried his face against the pillow. Kevin had better not mess this up. Chris came over the following day and found Jeffrey in the garage. He was oiling the chain on his bike when Chris pulled up. He was preparing for tonight, and Chris looked put out. Jeffrey could guess the source of his anger. Kevin had been radio silent since yesterday at school. Not a text, not a call, not anything. He forgot, and you know it," Chris said. "We don't know that," Jeffrey said, trying to remain positive. Though brilliant, Chris could be volatile and was prone to moodiness sometimes. Jeffrey didn't want him bailing out at the last minute. "He won't return my text, and his phone goes straight to voicemail. If he and his brother spent the night in Seaver, we could be screwed." Jeffrey started to speak, but at that moment, a familiar Jeep pulled up in his driveway. Kevin leaned in to say something to his brother, before taking a brown paper sack from the back seat as the Jeep drove off and Kevin approached the pair. He was all smiles, not reading the room at all, and when Chris walked towards him, he spread his arms out as he prepared to wrap him in one of his annoying bro hugs. When Chris socked him in the gut instead, Kevin's grin faded as he groaned and fell to his knees. Jeffrey pulled him back, but Kevin took it in strides as Jeffrey tried to pull the greaser away from him. "What was that for?" Kevin gasped, not really hurt, but definitely startled. "That is for bugging out and going radio silent for the last 24 hours. I dropped my phone in a puddle about 5 minutes after we got there. I didn't realize you two were so worried about me." Chris balled up his fists, straining against Jeffrey as he tried to hit Kevin again. Jeffrey pushed the greaser into a nearby recliner, kicking up a cloud of dust as he tried to settle Chris. "No worries, as long as you got the masks," Jeffrey said, still not holding out hope for the scatterbrained musclehead. Kevin's grin threatened to cut his head in half. "Oh, I got the masks. I think you'll find them very fitting, too." Jeffrey took the bag from Kevin, feeling the thick rubber masks inside the plain grocery bag. He reached in and pulled out a ghoulish orange mask that made him grin as wide as Kevin. The plastic thing looked like a demented jack-o'-lantern, its gaping black mouth cut into a frightening double row of teeth. Its black eyes were angled with malice, and Jeffrey could see a few plastic roaches crawling up the nostrils as he took it in. It was perfect. Jeffrey couldn't believe that Kevin had picked this out. It would be fitting to attack the town's established idols with their very likeness adorning their faces. He tossed a second mask to Chris, and the greaser goggled like a fool as he took in the ghoulish thing. Jeffrey could feel a lot of the anxiety melting away, and when he raised his hand this time, it was to give Kevin a hearty high five. "Kev, these are perfect." "You act like I would bring you anything less," Kevin said, with no small amount of swagger. Jeffrey pulled the mask on, feeling the plastic set on his face like a second skin. "Tonight, we're gonna make history." As the sun began to set and the trick-or-treaters started to gather on the sidewalk, the three set off on their bikes. They had their bats and their masks stored in their backpack, along with the required six-pack of beer to get into the party. They had dressed darkly in black pants and hoodies, and they were prepared to ride the streets like phantoms after dark. They arrived at Mark's party about 7, the festivities already in full swing. It was a typical high school underage drinking party. Lots of people making out in the living room, a collective of smoke clouds around the back and the front porch, people dancing around to loud music, and a kitchen that was 5 parts wet bar and 5 parts buffet. Mark's parents were out of town. They always seemed to be out of town, and Mark's house was typically the place where parties happened. The three stood around and sipped warm beer, keeping an eye on their watches, their nerves tuned up to 1,000,000,000. They didn't want to be there too long, just long enough to get noticed. They would say hi to some people from school, play a few rounds of beer pong, and at 9:45 they would slip out and take their bikes off quietly. They had been going over their individual routes for days. Chris would take 5th through 6th Street, Kevin would take 7th through 10th Street, and Jeffrey would take 11th through 15th Street. There were roughly 5 to 10 houses per street, and everyone would meet up downtown when they were done. If someone got done early, they would start smashing pumpkins downtown and wait for the others. If the cops came, they would run. The person discovered would lead them away so the others could keep smashing, and then meet back up when they lost them. They would not assume the vandals were organized. They would think they were holiday pranksters out for fun, and if they grabbed one of them, the other two could finish the night's work before anyone was the wiser. When Jeffrey's watch jangled to let them know it was 9:45, the three of them snuck out the back and rode off into the night. They split off at 10 o'clock. The front porch is dark, save for the glow of the jacks, and the streets were mostly free of trick-or-treaters. Jeffrey slipped on his mask as he came to 11th Street, grinning beneath it as he pulled his bat out. The first gourd he hit exploded in a shower of orange skin and wet innards. He smiled beneath the mask, smashing the other two and moving on to the next. The pumpkins were old by now, starting to rot, and his bat made quick work of them. Jeffrey had finished with the street in no time, his arm burning from the effort, but his desire for more burning hotter still. He had seen people peeking from their windows, but no blue and whites coming to chase him away. The work seemed too easy. The jack-o'-lanterns flew apart with a single swing of the bat, and Jeffrey reveled in the feel of his anger and fear being satiated. He would look back on that feeling throughout his years and feel deep shame, but tonight it was all about his revenge on the source of his terror. Jeffrey was not challenged until 12th Street. He had gotten cocky halfway through his culling. He wasn't content to just smash the pumpkins anymore. Oh no. Jeffrey had started throwing them against trees, mailboxes, and the houses that set silent guardians over them. No one came out to challenge him, their love for their pumpkins going only so far, and Jeffrey felt untouchable as he shattered his latest gourd against the door of 3608 12th Street. When the man lumbered from beside the porch, laying hands on Jeffrey as the boy grabbed for another pumpkin, Jeffrey was terrified for half a second. The mask had become turned in his effort, and he hadn't seen the man as he started sneaking around. The light was poor, but Jeffrey was pretty sure it was Mr. Bask, his English teacher. He was standing in his bathrobe and asking Jeffrey just what the hell he thought he was doing as he tried to wrestle the last of his pumpkins from him. Jeffrey had a short and squishy tug-of-war with Mr. Bask, and finally had the bright idea to just let the hateful gourd go. Jeffrey's fingers had started to slide through the thin skin at the pumpkin's base anyway, and the last thing he wanted was slime all over his hands. The old man stumbled backwards as Jeffrey released his hold and fell on his backside as the pumpkin splattered against him, covering him in soupy guts and rotten seeds. He looked at Jeffrey for a moment, so lost and afraid of this pumpkin demon who had visited his wrath on his home, and for a moment, Jeffrey came to his senses. He started towards him, wanting to help him up, but then the shadow fell across him, and he looked up to find a true demon standing on the sidewalk. He was standing in the shadow of a giant inflatable pumpkin, and the street light seemed loath to touch him. He was massive, a huge shadowed figure of steel and green. When he sliced the inflatable pumpkin with his axe or sword or whatever he carried, it sputtered in death as it puddled on the lawn. Jeffrey was frozen by him for a moment, his terror and anger at the pumpkins paling compared to his madness at the sight of this creature. Then it spoke, the voice of winter, and he was once again filled with that potent fire. "To hell with him! Your work must be fulfilled!" Jeffrey nodded, mounting his bike and riding off without a second glance at the prone man he'd left behind. By the time Jeffrey finished his work, it was nearly midnight. He had taken so long. How had he taken so long? He had been so taken by the act of destruction that Jeffrey had lost track of time. He was surprised that no one else had come out to challenge him, and wondered how no one had called the police yet. Jeffrey's clothes were splattered with pumpkin, his mask caked with dried seeds and goopy rind, but he didn't feel tired in the least bit. Quite the contrary, Jeffrey felt an almost maniacal need to see more pumpkins squashed beneath his bat. He rode downtown, feeling the cold breeze drive him forward, the chill stroking the blaze of his revenge. The fell breeze felt like oncoming winter, and it seemed to lend Jeffrey its power. As Jeffrey rode into downtown, he passed the remains of many smashed jack-o'-lanterns on the way. Chris and Kevin had been busy, it would seem. Tables had been overturned, and the gaping holes from the pumpkins greeted him as he rode. They had thrown them in the street, smashed windows on the storefronts, and scattered the guts of numerous gourds everywhere. If Jeffrey had been in his right mind, he would have doubtlessly seen this as a little too much. They hadn't agreed to this level of vandalism, nothing even close to this magnitude, but at that moment, Jeffrey was emboldened by the sight of such destruction. This was his will, so Jeffrey thought, and he would reward them for their efforts. Jeffrey felt the mist gathering over the town as much as he saw it. Its icy fingers were making chill bumps pop out on his arms, and he found himself looking for the figure on the sidewalk. Jeffrey expected him to appear out of the mist and cackle, congratulating Jeffrey for orchestrating such a fine bit of mischief, but if he was there, he was staying hidden for now. Jeffrey found Kevin and Chris on the commons. It seemed that this was where the police had been. The cruiser's blue and white lights were cutting through the fog, but they couldn't hold a candle to the blaze that burned on the commons. Jeffrey gawked at it, speechless at the towering bonfire the two had created. They had set the greenhouses on fire. They had set a pyre and called the police right to them. In his wonder and disbelief, though, Jeffrey forgot to keep an eye peeled for trouble. Someone pushed him suddenly, spilling him into the street. They fell on him as he wrenched his arms painfully behind his back, and the fall had knocked the wind out of him. He didn't have the strength to fight them off, and when they lifted Jeffrey to his feet, they shouted for him to stop resisting. Jeffrey was shoved towards a strobing vehicle and pushed into the back seat. He shimmied to the other side, wanting to see if his friends would escape, but what Jeffrey saw was far from what he had expected. Outside, Kevin and Chris were backing into the fog that swirled around the commons. The police were moving in, nightsticks in hand, and the cop that had cuffed Jeffrey was moving up behind them as he yelled into his radio. He didn't seem to be reaching the person that he wanted, though, because Jeffrey saw him jerk his head away as it crackled and sparked in his ear. He cursed and pulled it off, stomping on the box as it caught fire, and looked away from his fellow officers as he tried to put it out. That's why he didn't notice the figure that came riding out of the fog. But Jeffrey saw him. He saw his red eyes first, glowing from high in the fog as he came up behind his friends. He was tall, nearly 10 feet, and Jeffrey saw the two officers freeze as they noticed him. He came between Chris and Kevin, a single hoof stepping from the fog as his horse parted the mist. His armored form came next, his armor forest green, his horned helm the color of moss, his sword shrieking like a wildcat as he drew it out. Kevin and Chris didn't even look at him. Their pumpkin heads were still fixed on the officers. He was far more fantastic than Jeffrey could have imagined. Neither his dream nor the phantom on the sidewalk had done him justice. And when he charged, the officers broke like quail. Jeffrey heard him laugh, that bitter cackle that had haunted his dreams. When he sliced down the first officer, the man tried to impose his flimsy nightstick into the path of that vorpal blade. It sheared through the nightstick, the man's ballistic vest, and finally through his flesh. He fell to the ground in pieces, and the other two cops looked at the twitching pieces a little too long. The figure laid into them with gusto, and Jeffrey jumped as a head bounced off the front glass and rested on the hood. The rider slew them all, rode them down like children, and when he rode towards the cruiser, Jeffrey knew that he had arrived. The Green Man had returned. He leapt the car and rode into town, Chris and Kevin following mutely behind him. Jeffrey pivoted in the seat, screaming for them to help him. He kicked the door, kicked the glass until it splintered into a cascade of spider webs. But the rider and his grotesque minions were already disappearing into the fog. They left him there with the bodies. They left him there to take the blame. Jeffrey kicked until his legs ached. He screamed until his throat felt like it would break. He pulled on the cuffs until his wrists bled. In the end, though, it didn't matter in the slightest. More cops arrived as the mist dissipated. Jeffrey was taken to jail, his mask removed, and his identity discovered. He was thrown in a jail cell, alone, while the cops tried to sort out the havoc that was going on around town. Calls were coming in from all over town. 17 more deaths were reported that night. Fires were blazing in several homes, broken sprinklers and fire hydrants that seemed to have frozen in the balmy October air, and too much vandalism to keep track of. Mark's party had been turned into a bloodbath, and the kids who had escaped were saying that it was a guy with a sword and two guys in pumpkin masks with bats. Through it all, Jeffrey just sat in a dejected state in his cell. They had left him. He had been found unworthy, and now he would rot like one of those pumpkins he had shattered into so much useless paste. At some point, Jeffrey must have dozed off, because when he returned to himself, the sheriff was leaning against the bars of his cell, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. "Good. You're awake." Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how everything seems to go to hell the second I decide to leave town for an evening. My granddaughter wanted me to take her trick-or-treating, so I drove to the next town over to oblige her, and come back to a whole mess of problems. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, son?" Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how you decided to smash up all the pumpkins. You know why the early citizens carved those pumpkins, don't you?" Jeffrey continued saying nothing. "Sure you do. There's a mural in the museum. You've probably seen it 1,000 times, but never really thought much about it. The settlers that founded this place came fleeing something they didn't really understand, something they prayed they had left in the old country. That image on the mural of the tide riding down on us, that's not English invaders as we sometimes pretend for the tourists. Granddad said his granddad told him stories of the Green Man, a spirit of winter who sought sacrifice and punished those who would not give him his due." Through it all, Jeffrey said nothing. "That's why we light the jack-o'-lanterns. That's why the tradition is still here today. We light them so we might forget that demon who once haunted us. We light them because they keep him away. You've left us naked in the breeze, boy. You've burned our greenhouses, smashed our talismans, and now there'll be nothing to stop him from coming back tonight." The sheriff stared at him, but Jeffrey said nothing. "Did you see him, boy? Did you see that devil?" He wrung his hands over the bars like a drowning man treading water, but Jeffrey refused to answer him. After he'd wrung those bars for a few minutes, the sheriff finally left. Jeffrey never saw him again. Jeffrey never saw much of anyone ever again. When he heard the creak and groan of pavement and metal being separated, Jeffry smiled. He knew they had come for him, and when the bars on the street parted from the cement, he looked up to see Kevin and Chris had returned for him. They were still wearing their masks, but Jeffry had an idea that those masks weren't rubber anymore. Jeffry had an idea that those masks were permanent now, and his would be too, once he slipped it on. Jeffry crawled onto street level, falling to his knees when he saw that he was with them. The voice in his head told him that he needed one more. Those two imps needed a leader. The rider tossed something rubber to the pavement at Jeffrey's feet, and with trembling hands, Jeffry slid the grotesque pumpkin mask back on. The voice told him he had work to do. The green man called Jeffry to action, and who was he to deny him? "Come on, Dad, let's go!" Lily stomped a slipper-clad foot on the sidewalk as she looked back at her father. She was ready to go trick-or-treating, and it seemed like nothing but Josh was standing in the way of her sweet treats. He was sitting on the front step of his childhood home, a well-loved cul-de-sac teeming with costumed children. The moon hung overhead, a ghostly sickle that presided over this Halloween night, and her dad was sitting with his back against the smooth stairs, as he found his eyes tracking the multitudes as they passed. The children laughed and screamed as they stalked by, the street a sea of superheroes, video game characters, colorful animals, and everything in between. He let his eyes drift past the excited pageantry, though. He was looking for one shape in particular. Josh's mom smiled at him, slipping her hand into Lily's and giving her a little tug. "Come on, hun. Your dad's waiting for someone. We'll go trick-or-treating while he waits." Lily looked interested. "Who are you waiting for, Daddy?" Of course, she wouldn't have remembered from last year. She'd been excited about trick-or-treating, showing off her Wonder Woman costume, and swinging between her father and her mother's hands as they walked. However, Laura was 6 months pregnant this year, and had opted out of the hour drive to get to his mother's house. She had smiled at Josh knowingly as he left, and told him to tell her hi for her. Lily's grandmother smoothed her hair as it sat under the tall princess hat. "It's just an old friend, dear. Your father meets him here every year." "Well, you're gonna miss out on the candy," Lily said, her tone stating firmly that she wouldn't be sharing if he didn't come. Josh smiled. "That's okay, Lily. You go and have fun with Grandma, okay?" Lily just shrugged, her grandmother's tugging hand finally leading her towards the waiting cacophony of spooky delights. She glanced back as they walked onto the street, but was soon lost in the crowd and probably wouldn't remember anything about this conversation until next year. Josh leaned back, getting comfy as he waited for him to arrive. He did this every year, every Halloween after that first so many years ago. In many ways, the visits were what Josh looked forward to the most about Halloween. Sure, the candy was nice, the costumes were great, but seeing his friend was why he always came home for Halloween. No matter where Josh was, no matter what he was doing, he always came home for Halloween. This was the night he got to see him. This was the night that Josh got to see Snarf again. Snarf had been a mutt. He was a bull terrier mixed with a basset hound mixed with God only knew what else. They had grown up together. Snarf was just a puppy when Josh had got him, and he was Josh's best friend for many years. When Josh thought back on that time in his life, he was glad he had gotten Snarf when he did. Kindergarten had been a difficult time for him, and his sheltered upbringing hadn't really prepared him for suddenly being around so many children. He was awkward, and not what you would call popular. He had thick glasses, was overweight, and his isolation had made him painfully shy. The other kids who had gone to daycare and Cub Scouts and T-ball together, took one look at him and dismissed him as a social outcast. It was tough, being unwanted at the age of 5. His mom thought a dog might help Josh's confidence, or at least ease some of the loneliness. In many ways, Josh believed his mother had recognized that the funk he was in was partially her fault, and was trying to make amends. She worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and often Josh was left in the care of his grandmother. She loved him and always doted on him, but she wasn't always up for the games a 5-year-old would be interested in. Thinking about it over the years, Josh often thought that Snarf was a way for her to alleviate some of the guilt about leaving him alone. Whatever the reason, he had loved her for it. His mother found Snarf at the Humane Society. He was a little smiling ball of fluff, and when he put his feet against the glass, she had known that he would be perfect. He had been waiting for Josh when she had come to pick him up that day, and the boy's surprise had turned to joy as the wet puppy tongue slid over his face. They sat in the back seat the whole way home, the dog's head against his stomach, panting happily as Josh scratched him behind the ears. He was that rare animal whose temperament never led him to jump up on people or bark for no reason. His accidents were few and far between, and he was easy to house train. They called him Snarf because he had a deviation in his nose that caused him to make a snarfing sound rather than a proper bark. He was the best dog, the only one Josh had ever owned, and Josh had flourished with the help of his new companion. Snarf had gotten him out of the house, helping him shed some of the baby fat that had made him the subject of so much ridicule. He had also been a great icebreaker to help Josh introduce himself to some of the neighborhood kids. By the time he had entered first grade, Josh had a few pals, but none of them could hold a candle to his friendship with that wiggling little mass of fur and ears. He was eternally thankful for the time he'd gotten with Snarf, but it would never have been enough. Josh dumped a fistful of candy into each of their buckets, and the trio of Disney princesses said thank you as they ran to the next house in a flurry of skirts and sneakers. A pirate wandered up and gave him his best "Arg!" Josh rewarded him with a couple of full-size Snicker bars, and he thanked him before wobbling off on his fake peg leg. Josh kept scanning the crowd, unsure what was taking his friend so long this year. He was usually here by now, but he had been late before. He sat up a little as he saw a small ghost, 4 legs poking from below a bedsheet. When it turned and wagged its tail at a larger ghost who was walking behind it, Josh got comfortable again. He sat scanning around, hoping it wouldn't be too much longer. He'd sit here all night if he had to, though. Josh would sit here till midnight if it bought him 5 minutes with his buddy. Josh had Snarf for 5 years, and those 5 years were filled with mostly good times between a boy and his dog. Snarf was never a chewer or prone to digging holes, and Josh couldn't remember ever having to fill in a hole or run after him as he chased a cat. Snarf also knew where the boundaries of his home were, and Josh never saw him run out of the yard or get in the road after a car. He was a good boy, and the neighborhood loved him. He would likely have a long and happy life if it hadn't been for Josh. To this day, he blamed himself for what had happened to Snarf. It had all started when Reggie moved into the neighborhood. Reggie moved in when Josh was 10, and his family took up residence in the Cranston house. Mr. Cranston had died about a month before, and though his family hadn't been neighbors with them, Mr. Cranston was a nice old man who was known to the whole neighborhood. He had always had the best yard displays for Christmas or Halloween, and he had given out the best candy to trick-or-treaters. When the ambulance came to take him away one night, everyone had hoped for the best, but poor Mr. Cranston had died of a heart attack. Luckily, he had been on the phone with his daughter when it had happened, or who knows when they would have found him. So when a moving van came up the street bound for Mr. Cranston's old house, Josh and his friends had hopped on their bikes and went to check it out. Josh had a group of friends that he hung out with then. Terry, Walt, and Patrick lived in the same neighborhood as he did, and they'd been friends for years. When the new boy was seen unpacking boxes from the van, they introduced themselves and welcomed him to the neighborhood. He was a big kid, tall and muscular, and Josh had gotten a weird feeling about him almost at once. "I'm Josh," he said, extending a hand. "We were just about to go play some ball if you're interested." "Reggie," the boy said, squeezing his hand a little too hard, almost like he meant to hurt him. "Yeah, sounds like that might be fun." One short conversation was enough to let the boys know that Reggie's interests were different than theirs. Most of them had agreed later that they felt he probably wasn't going to be a good fit for the group, and not just because of his attitude. He had scoffed at their comic books, asked if they were babies when they talked about action figures, and when he'd said that baseball sounded fun, it made everyone shiver a little. He was large, a sneering boy, and they all decided to keep their distance from him as they said their goodbyes and pedaled away. But of course, Reggie lived on the block, so he inevitably found a place in their games. He was never invited, always just sort of invited himself. He made the teams uneven, and no one seemed to want him to play, but the boys were too polite to tell him to buzz off. That was how it started, but Josh and his friends had regretted giving in so easily almost at once. They'd been correct in their assumptions that he liked to hurt people. He had nearly broken Patrick's wrist when he fouled him during basketball. He had shoved Terry off his bike during a bike race, skinning both his hands and his knees, and every time he threw a football to you, you either caught it or you wound up with a bloody nose. By the end of the summer, their politeness had turned into fear, and they were all too afraid of him to tell him to go away when he came to invite himself to their games. They were playing baseball when it happened. Reggie had seen them setting up and inserted himself into the game, as he usually did. Terry sighed loudly, covering it up with a cough when Reggie got close enough to hear them. Josh and Terry had tried to explain that letting him play would make the teams uneven, but Reggie didn't really care. He made it pretty clear that he was going to play whether they liked it or not, and there wasn't really anything that could be done about it. Snarf had walked up then, snuffling Josh's hand for pats, and Josh had dropped to his knees to give him scratches. The dog accepted the attention, but his eyes never left Reggie, and Josh could see the mistrust in them. Reggie was the only person that Josh had ever seen elicit a growl from the usually good-natured dog. Reggie had quickly learned not to come into Josh's yard, as Snarf would not tolerate him. This was fine with Josh, because unlike the others, whose houses Reggie frequently visited, Snarf had kept him out of his yard and his fingers off of Josh's stuff. Josh was also careful to keep Snarf inside when he wasn't out there to supervise him. He had seen the way Reggie's piggy little eyes narrowed when he looked at the dog, and Josh knew enough to be cautious. He wished he'd just put Snarf inside when he started growling that day, but he had pushed it away and hoped it would help Reggie know that they wouldn't tolerate any funny business. The game had gone about as well as expected until the 5th inning. Reggie and Terry had been team captains, and Reggie had won the coin toss, so he got to pick first. Reggie and Walt had been on a team, and Terry and Josh had been on another, with Patrick acting as an umpire or standing in if someone got tired. Reggie had belted a few down the road, and he and Walt were winning 7-3. The trade-off for Reggie's freakish strength was that he wasn't particularly coordinated. He missed a few fly balls and let a few slide between his legs, so Josh and Terry weren't as far behind as they could have been. There had been some good-natured shoving, as good-natured as it ever got with Reggie, but there was no real violence to speak of. Snarf had gone to lounge on his lawn, and the boys were actually having fun, despite 4 of them having to keep an eye on the 5th. It all went south when Reggie took the plate again. He cracked it a good one, and Josh and Terry prepared to get out of the way as Reggie ran. Reggie did not believe in dropping the bat after hitting the ball, as the bruises on the boy's ankles could attest. The bat made a loud crack as it hit the ball, and as it sailed off down the street, Josh made a dash for it. Reggie came running around first base, Terry hovering between second and third, as Patrick stood on the manhole that was serving as the pitcher's mound. Patrick had quickly figured out that a third might be required when the teams took the field, and had agreed to be the pitcher and the umpire. Walt was whistling as Reggie ran for second, and the ball bounced once before Josh grabbed it. He had turned to throw it when he heard Terry yell out in pain. Terry, Walt would later tell him, had tripped Reggie as he ran past, and the big boy had fallen and skinned his hands and knees. Reggie had come up mad, cracking him in the stomach with the bat, and towering over him as the fallen boy prepared to have his skull caved in. Josh dropped the ball, sprinting towards the pair, as Reggie lifted the bat up to hit Terry again. Walt ran from the sidelines as Patrick came shouting and telling Reggie to knock it off. All 3 of them knew they wouldn't make it before he hit Terry, and they were just hoping to get there before he hit him again. Fast as they were, though, Snarf was faster. Snarf hit Reggie in the back, sending him reeling forward and dropping him into the street a second time. He stood over Terry protectively, snarling and showing his teeth at Reggie's back. Reggie was getting back up, shaking his head, but Snarf didn't seem to want to attack him. He just stood over Terry, the boy still frozen in surprise and fear. Reggie got back on his feet, his knuckles turning white against the bat's handle as he squeezed. Josh saw him turn in slow motion, the boy still running for Terry, but it made no difference. Snarf was staring daggers at Reggie, but when Josh called his name, he looked towards him, tail wagging. The bat crashed down on the dog, and the pitiful noise he made sent a shard of glass through Josh's guts. Walt and Patrick arrived in time to grab Terry under the arms and drag him away from the scene. Josh hit Reggie as hard as he could around the waist, dropping him to the concrete a 3rd time and sending the bat clinking across the asphalt with an angry wooden clitter. Reggie hit his head on the concrete, and as the wind oofed out of him, Josh punched him in the face. He saw Reggie's eyes glaze a little with the impact, his lips quivering in surprise as his head bounced off the pavement again. Josh got off him, picking up the bat as Reggie tried to get his bearings. Josh pointed the bat at Reggie, yelling at him to get out of here. He told him not to come near him, his friends, or his dog again. He said some of the adult words he knew, the cusses sounding high and whispery as he fought back tears. Reggie got up on an elbow, grinning at Josh as he seemed to dare him to do anything. When the other 3 boys came up behind him, though, Reggie realized that he might be in trouble if he decided to act in haste. He could take 1 kid, bat or no bat, but 4 kids would probably beat the tar out of him. So, he backed up on his hands before breaking into a run and fleeing for home. Josh would never feel bad about what he had done to Reggie, but looking back at that moment, he would feel a lot of shame. The shame came from letting his anger blind him to Snarf's pain, from letting his need to dispel Reggie separate him from his dog when he needed him most. It didn't matter, though. None of it really mattered. When Josh turned back around, it was already too late. Josh found himself glaring at Reggie's old house as he watched a pair of Transformers walk off with their chocolate. The house was occupied now, but it had been empty for quite some time after the family had moved away. That had happened later, months after he'd killed Snarf, and those months felt like an eternity at the time. Reggie's parents had refused to believe that their son had killed Snarf, and they seemed angrier that Josh and his friends had beaten up their son. When they threatened to call the police, after Reggie had come home with scrapes and bruises, Josh's mom had just dropped the whole thing. Reggie's parents are threatening to sue us for hospital costs, and I can't afford something like that, sweetie. I'm sorry about Snarf, but if we call the cops, we'll be in trouble as well. She told Josh this, and he had seethed in his 10-year-old heart. He saw a big blonde kid with a crew cut, dressed in a karate gi, and he almost didn't hand him anything. Reggie was still on his mind, and this kid could have passed for him once upon a time. His eyes, they didn't really have that evil gleam in them, though, and Josh smiled at him as he handed him some candy. The kid threw him a mock salute and rejoined the throng still parading up the street. Reggie had been bigger, meaner, but in the end, Reggie had not been braver. Josh had been inconsolable after the death of Snarf. He had pretended to be sick for a week, and his mother had just let him pretend in the wake of his sorrow. His grandma stayed with him, often just sitting with Josh while he wallowed in his misery. She never pushed him as he moped around the house, just letting him feel his hurt as she waited for it to pass. He mostly just lay on the couch and watched TV, not really paying attention, just liking the noise. As they sat there one afternoon, her arm draped around him, she told Josh something he would never forget. "I know you miss your friend, but you can't let his death be the end of your life. You have to live it for both of you now. It's what he would have wanted." Josh looked up at her with big swimmy eyes. But I miss him." She smiled. "I know you do, but it's almost Halloween, a time when they say the ghosts of our loved ones can walk the earth again. Maybe, just maybe, his love will be great enough to bring him back to you." That made him think. If ghosts and spirits could walk the earth on Halloween, then maybe Snarf could too. Josh spent the rest of the month in a little better mood, waiting for Halloween night so he could see if Snarf would come and visit. His mom had to work on Halloween, but Grandma was home with him and said that she could take him out trick-or-treating if he wanted. Josh didn't want to go out, though. He sat in his room and watched out the window, hoping to see Snarf as he ran up the front walk. When his friends came to see him, they were all costumed and looking for him to join their group. They begged him to trick-or-treat with them. They hadn't seen him in months. He hadn't come out to play since the baseball game, and they missed him. Each of them was dressed as a different Power Ranger, and Terry said his grandma had sent him a second costume if Josh wanted to use it. Josh had a feeling that Terry had bought it in case he decided to come out with them, and though touched, Josh still didn't want to go. He might miss Snarf, and he wanted to see him if he came back. Once again, Grandma had the answer. "I'll keep an eye out for him, and I'll tell him to stay if he comes to see you while you're gone." Josh was hesitant, but after some coaxing, he put on the costume and left with his group of friends. They had made him the Blue Ranger, his favorite Power Ranger, and as they set out into the night, he felt a little better. Josh had missed his friends over the past few weeks, but after what had happened, he just couldn't bring himself to see them. Going out with him now made him feel a lot better, and they spent a few blissful hours filling their sacks with candy. It would have been a perfect Halloween if Reggie hadn't come. Josh started noticing lights going out in the cul-de-sac as it ticked closer to 10. The kids who were present were becoming older, the little kids already turning in, and he furrowed his brow as Snarf still hadn't appeared. He felt like he had on that first Halloween after Snarf's death, looking for him as he'd walked the streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Josh heard a bark and snapped his head to the side expectantly. He frowned, though, when he saw it was just a lab in a bee costume. Its owner came hurrying after him, followed by a football player heading for the next house. A pair of ninjas wandered up next, and Josh sighed as he dug them out some candy. Surely he wouldn't stand him up. He hadn't stood him up that night, so why start now? It was almost 10 by the time the lights started going out on that long-ago Halloween. The street began to empty, and Josh's bag was beginning to get heavy. He and his friends had bulging sacks of candy, and they were sitting on the sidewalk and trading. Josh had started out looking for Snarf, glancing around as they walked against the tide of excited children. In those 2 hours, he had gotten a reprieve from his sadness, but as the night wound down, the old feelings were starting to fester again. He told his friends that he had to get home, and Josh started looking for him again as he moved through the thinning group of trick-or-treaters. He wanted to get home so he could see if Snarf had come back, which was probably why he missed Reggie. When the egg hit him in the side of the head, Josh staggered under the impact. His ear rang, and he thought he was bleeding when his gloved hand came away wet. One look told him it was just egg yolk, though. He looked across the street and saw Reggie grinning at him from under a lamppost. He wasn't in costume, dressed in his baseball shorts and a tank top, but he did have a silver bat in his hand, tossing an egg up and catching it in his other as he smiled. Josh froze when he saw that he was staring at him, realizing how vulnerable he was out here alone with his house 3 streetlights away. "Been waiting for you to come out. We got unfinished business, Four Eyes. I think I owe you the same sort of beating I gave your stupid dog," he chuckled, swinging the bat experimentally. Josh stepped off the curve towards him, angry at what he had said, but thought better of it immediately. That metal bat could cave his skull in, and Reggie was pretty good at swinging bats. He glanced towards his house instead. 3 streetlights didn't seem so far, and Josh thought he could probably run faster than Reggie if it came to it. It seemed it was either run or sit here and get killed by this psycho. The choice seemed pretty obvious. He made the first light, easily outstriping Reggie, but Josh heard him getting closer as he moved under the second light. Reggie slapped the light pole with the bat as he went by, and it made a hollow thunk sound as it connected. Josh started to panic when he heard it. What if he caught him? What if he killed him? Would he die in the street like Snarf had? Josh wished that Snarf was here as his tears streamed down his face. He would have protected him. Snarf would have stopped Reggie from hurting him. If Josh hadn't distracted him that day, maybe Snarf would be here to help him. His house was in sight when the second egg cracked him in the back of the head. He stumbled as the egg connected. Josh had forgotten about the eggs. Though it hadn't been thrown very hard, it surprised him. Josh staggered into the fence that separated his yard from the neighbor's and crashed against it with a loud thunk. His head connected with the boards as he fell, and his head swam a little as the cheap plastic mask broke into pieces. Josh was reaching out in slow motion, moving his hands and legs like someone wading through mud. He rolled onto his butt as he prepared to take off again, but it was too late. Reggie loomed over him, the streetlight gleaming off his bat. "Looks like I caught you, Four Eyes," Reggie said, raising the bat. "Say hi to your dog for me when you see him." Josh pushed up against the fence, hoping it would fall backwards, knowing it wasn't going anywhere. Reggie raised the bat high, the metal twinkling as the light made galaxies of starbursts. Josh closed his eyes, preparing for the blow that would end his life prematurely. When the growl split the night, though, he opened his eyes and looked between Reggie's splayed legs. Reggie had turned his head to look at the shadowy crevice between the house and the fence that now stopped Josh from escaping. Between the structures stood a snarling, red-eyed creature that seemed to fill the space with its shadowy mass. Reggie took a sidelong step away from Josh, the beast snarling hugely as it took a single thunderous step towards him. Josh felt his breath hitch as Reggie stepped into the street, and the looming thing lowered its head and rumbled. Josh's brain couldn't fathom it. This nightmare creature had appeared in his neighborhood out of nowhere, and was now seconds away from ending both him and his bully. When it loosed that single ear-splitting snarl, Josh put his head between his knees and pushed his palms against his ears. He sat in the darkness, screaming against his legs as he prepared to be devoured. Josh had assumed that he would die that night after running from the hulking brute, but never like this. When the warm tongue slid over his hair, he cracked the back of his head against the fence, trying to escape again. Then he opened his eyes, gasping like a trapped animal, to find Snarf's panting, grinning face. Reggie was gone, Bat lying in the street, and Josh wrapped his arms around his lost friend. He laughed as Snarf licked his cheek. He pressed his face against the dog's familiar short fur, and Josh's sadness melted away as Snarf's doggy tongue bombarded him. That was how his mom had found him, laughing with his back against the fence as her headlights dissipated the ghostly dog licking him as he'd done so many times before. Snarf had come back and visited him on Halloween night every year since. His mother didn't come right out and say it at first. She was upset about his injuries, but she told Josh later that she had seen Snarf for a few seconds before her headlights hit him. After he told her what had happened with Reggie, she called the police. She gave them the bat, told them how Reggie had been a problem this summer, and started a process of having a restraining order placed against him. She was tired of being bullied by Reggie's parents, as tired as Josh was of being bullied by Reggie. Reggie's family moved shortly before the order was finalized. Josh never saw him again, and was happier for it. Josh watched his mother walk up the front lawn now, Lily in her arms as she sleepily held onto her sack of candy. She was stumbling on the way back. "I think we're going to have some cocoa, if you'd like to join us." "Give me a few more minutes, Mom. I think he's just running late this year." Mom smiled. "Take all the time you need, dear." She walked inside, leaving him on the stoop. The street was emptying, only a few stragglers heading for home, and Josh glanced around furtively. Where was Snarf? Had he forgotten about his old friend? 20 years was a long time to visit someone who wasn't a little boy anymore. Maybe he had... Josh dropped the bowl of candy when that ghostly cold nose prodded his hand. He looked down to find Snarf, tail wagging, as he smiled up at him from the front lawn of the house he had loved so much. Josh wrapped his arms around him, and it felt like coming home again. George looked down at the smashed gourd and wondered who could have possibly done such a thing. His father had grown pumpkins in this field for generations, and nothing like this had ever happened. The Fontenoys had 500 acres, half of which were just for pumpkins. The east field had been set aside for pumpkin growth, and the jack-o'-lanterns on the fence posts of the field had been smashed to bits. Laying in the road, they appeared to have been left as a warning. It wasn't many, maybe 15 gourds in all, but Daddy looked worried. George tried to mimic the look, and his father must have found it funny on a 10-year-old, because he laughed, dispelling some of the worry that had hung around him like a cloud. "What happened, Daddy?" George asked, smiling a little as the tension wafted away. "Well, kiddo, I think maybe some hellions came and wrecked up our jack-o'-lanterns." "What are hellions?" George asked, getting a little afraid as he thought about monsters or devils coming out after dark. "Oh, just kids out for a good time. Normally I wouldn't be too mad about a little Halloween goofing, but they may not be done, and next time it might be the pumpkins in the field. I can't just stand by and let that pass. Come on, Georgie, we're going to have to go call the sheriff." They tromped back to the house, putting their work on hold as they went to call Sheriff Langford. Juan passed them as they left the field, and Daddy told him to get some boys together and clean up the pumpkins. Juan said that he would, and called to the others in that rich Spanish that George was starting to pick up. Juan and Maiko were teaching him some of the basics, but when they spoke together, George was lost amidst the words as they came spilling out. Daddy said they spoke like a river, fast and dangerous. George thought they spoke like the people he saw in church sometimes, the ones who had been touched by the Holy Spirit. "Daddy," George asked as they came into the house, "why would someone do that to our pumpkins?" "Well, son," his dad said, fingers turning the dial on the phone he refused to replace, "sometimes people are jealous of what a man has. Sometimes, instead of coveting it, they decide they might want to destroy it. Sometimes it's because they can't make it themselves. Sometimes it's just greed, but they can't really help themselves. In the end, it all amounts to the same thing. A man either has to be broken of it, or he has to die." George heard someone pick up on the other end, and his daddy told the dispatcher he needed the sheriff to the farm right away. George watched as his father laid out the situation for the sheriff. He needed someone to investigate this little issue. He couldn't have this sort of thing happening to his crops. If it was hooligans, then he didn't want to press charges. Boys would be boys, after all, but he wanted this to stop. When Daddy hung up, he seemed in a much better temperament, and George was glad to see him smile again. "Looks like everything's going to be okay, kiddo." George smiled, following his dad out to the field. If his daddy said everything was going to be okay, George saw no reason to doubt him. The next day, though, it was even worse. Juan came to get him and his dad while they ate their breakfast, his face unhappy to have to give such news so early in the morning. "Mr. Fontenaire, there has been a problem with the pumpkins again." Daddy had been putting salt on his grits, a fried egg buried somewhere amongst the grain mush, and he looked up unhappily as he told Juan to show him. George left his shredded wheat on the table and went to see what all the fuss was about, shivering as he walked out into the chilly morning air. The sun was just peeking up over the farm, and his arms prickled with goosebumps as the air lay heavy on them. The three walked out amongst the field, the corn parting for them as they headed out to see about the pumpkins. There were broken pumpkins along the fence line, and it appeared that they had come into the field this time. 30 or 40 broken gourds were laying in the field, their skin glistening in the early morning sun. George and his father picked through them, seeing what could be salvaged, but most of it was awash. They found 4 that weren't too badly damaged, and George asked if he could use them for jack-o'-lanterns. Daddy said that he didn't see any reason why not. Despite being mostly whole, they were still damaged, and he'd never be able to sell them. After his chores, George sat on the porch and carved his pumpkins, as his father called the sheriff and had him out to see what had happened. The sheriff's visit had been different the day before. Daddy had been more amused than angry, but today he seemed really mad about the pumpkins. He and the sheriff had joked about the pumpkins they had smashed and the tricks they had gotten up to in their day yesterday. Daddy had told him again that he didn't want to press any charges, but he definitely wanted this to end. Today, George could hear him shouting at the sheriff that this was getting out of hand and it needed to stop. "We'll put a cruiser across the road tonight and see if we can see 'em. If they come back tonight, we can catch 'em in the act and drag 'em in. Might mean you have to lose a few more pumpkins, but it'll probably mean the end of it for sure. If I keep losing pumpkins, Frank, I'm going to take this into my own hands. I don't want to shoot somebody's kid, but I will if this keeps up. Don't do anything hasty, Mark. Let the law handle this." "Like you did yesterday?" Daddy said, and the sheriff didn't seem to have an answer for that one. George tried to show his father the pumpkins when he came stomping up the porch, but he didn't seem to notice. As the sun went down, George lit the candles in 3 of his pumpkins, but saved the 4th as he wanted to do something special with it. There was a little ledge on the window of his room, and he toted the small pumpkin upstairs and pushed the door to his room open with his foot. The pumpkin overlooked the farm from its high perch, and as George lit the candle with a long kitchen match, it filled the alcove with a sick kind of yellow light. He heard his father call from downstairs to tell him that dinner was ready, and he blew the candle out as he closed the window. He'd light it again after it got good and dark. That way he could turn the pumpkin to face him and watch its spooky grin flicker. From up here, he could see the fields of pumpkins, including the bare area that Juan and his friends had cleared out. George wondered how many more would be broken tomorrow, and he hoped it would be none. Daddy would be really mad at all the smashed pumpkins. George remembered a time not long ago when his father had been so mad that he'd locked himself in his room for a week. That had been after Mama had gone to be with Jesus, and taken his little sister with her, too. George didn't want to see Daddy like that again. After dinner, George went to his room to play a little, but his daddy went out to the field with his rifle, saying he was going to sit out and keep watch from the porch. George sat awake for a while that night, but as the crickets chirped and the frogs croaked outside, George felt his eyes getting heavier and heavier. The last thing he saw as he drifted off was the pumpkin's glowing face as it winked at him from the small ledge. It had gone out by the time he woke up, but his father's anger had only intensified. He could hear him yelling from the front lawn, and George snuck downstairs, peeking out the front door to see what all the ruckus was about. Daddy was shouting at the sheriff, who was already standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. He looked peaceful, but George could tell that he really didn't appreciate getting yelled at so early in the morning. "You say you had your best man on it, but still, I have smashed pumpkins all over my damn field." "I know you're upset, Mark, but you might want to remember who you're talking to. I'm an officer of the law, and I won't sit here and listen to you disrespect me. Then why didn't your man do his job out there? I've got half a field of pumpkins that are nothing more than fertilizer now. If this fellow was at his post like he was supposed to be, he could have stopped that from happening." "I dunno. He should still be out there since he never checked in this morning." The two of them had gone to the sheriff's cruiser, hitting the mic and trying to raise the officer who had come to watch the farm last night. When the sheriff couldn't get an answer, he and George's father had headed into the field, George trailing behind them. He was curious, wanting to see what the two men were talking about. If the officer had fallen asleep, George figured he'd be getting yelled at, and that could be funny to watch. As they crossed the field, now empty of a few more pumpkins, George hung back in the corn. He didn't want to make it obvious that he was following them, but he still wanted to see what would happen. As George peeked through the stalks, he could see the squad car sitting down a small access road across from his father's farm. His dad and the sheriff approached the car, and they must have seen something they didn't like. The sheriff ran up to the car, and when he opened the door, something came tumbling out and splatted onto the ground. His daddy ran over too, and as they lifted the thing up, George could see it was a man in a policeman's uniform. Even with the corn stalks obscuring his vision, it was impossible to miss that the man's head was smashed in. George snuck back to his room as the sheriff used the radio to call for help. George sensed that things had become very bad. That was the first night that George saw the hellions. He was sitting at his window, watching his father as he paced around the yard and kept watch. It was late, the moon hanging high overhead, but George just couldn't get to sleep. He had sat on the front porch most of the day, his deer rifle across his lap. Things had changed after the sheriff found the body, and now the farm felt like a prison. Juan and the hands went about the usual chores, rotating the crops that needed to be taken in and clearing away the mess from the night before. The hooligans had flattened about 30 to 40 pumpkins, and now there wasn't a pumpkin anywhere near the road. The area around the fence was cleared away, and appeared to be getting closer to the house with each passing night. Daddy had set up that whole night, watching the field with his rifle, as 2 squad cars circled the farm every half hour. When the sun came up, the pumpkins had still been smashed. The cops could talk about the thick fog that had rolled in the early morning, but that hadn't stopped Daddy from being completely furious with everyone. George had woken up to the sound of his dad telling the sheriff that he didn't need the police. He told them not to bother coming back that night, that he and his men could handle this, and that he didn't need such ineffective help. The sheriff had been calm throughout the whole endeavor, and finally told his daddy not to do anything foolish. If you shoot some kids for smashing up your pumpkins, I can't arrest you, but the town might have other ideas. I'd hate to see a lynch mob raised because of a little Helen. As the cruiser rolled off, Daddy yelled for Juan and the others to get to work before heading off to bed. He hadn't told George to keep watch, but he hadn't had to. This was George's farm, his birthright one day, and it was as much his to protect as it was his dad's. When his father came onto the porch at sunset, seeing his son out there with his deer rifle, his eyes heavy, he had ruffled his hair and told him to go on ahead to bed, that he'd take watch now. As George went inside, he knew he should be exhausted, but as he watched his father pace around, he found that he couldn't be less tired. As he sat and watched, he saw something roll in slowly. A thick fog came creeping over the crops. It wasn't a normal fog, not the wispy stuff they got this time of year. It was thick and deep, a winter fog, and as it crawled across the field, George saw shapes stumbling through it. As it came close to the house, George could see it part as if it refused to come any closer to the porch. Daddy stood amongst it, barely visible, but George wasn't looking at him. He was watching the figures who came creeping towards the house. They were man-shaped, but their heads were lumpy and deformed. They moved seamlessly through the fog, cutting through it like a shark through water. They approached the porch, clearly looking for George's father, and as he took notice of them, he cut loose with his shotgun. George jumped as the blasts parted the fog, but if the bullets bothered them, they didn't show it. His daddy backed up, firing again before reaching for more shells, and as they came closer, George could see why their heads looked so strange. They were topped with pumpkins. Each of their heads was a sneering jack-o'-lantern. Their eyes seemed to blaze with hateful fires, and George thought he could hear them chuckling to themselves as they approached. They carried farm implements in their hands, scythes and hatchets and hoes, and the longer he watched them, the more of them George saw. At first, It had seemed like only 3, but as they continued to spill out of the fog, George counted as many as a dozen. They came closer and closer, and Daddy blasted them from the porch as they backed him towards the door. His bullets had little effect on them, but George noticed them stop when they saw the jack-o'-lanterns he'd put on the porch rails. The group paused, halted by their smiling, glowing counterparts, and as they turned to leave, George could only shake his head and wonder why. When the door banged open, George flung himself into bed when he heard Daddy come thundering up the stairs, worried that he might get in trouble. As the adrenaline left him, he felt his eyes getting heavy as he focused on the flickering protector outside his window, the candle burning low as he went to sleep. George and his father were coming off the porch when his daddy saw Juan in his hands taking more pumpkins into barrows from the east field. Even from here, George could tell that they looked too hurried in their work, and his father sped up as he came towards the men. Some of them put their heads down and hurried along, but Juan stood his ground and waited to receive the reprimand he knew was coming. "Mr. Fontener, we were just cleaning up some of the pumpkins there before I noticed," his father asked, barely keeping the anger out of his voice. Juan nodded, not looking away. "Yes, sir." "How many?" George's father asked, winter ice in his voice. "There are about 70 pumpkins left. The ones we found this morning look like they were frozen in the field before they broke them. I don't understand how they did that, but they've been ruined nonetheless." Daddy nodded, but his glowering never changed. "I want you and your boys to come by tonight. We'll take all the pumpkins left and put them in the barn. Tonight, we're gonna catch whoever's been doing this. Tell your friends to bring whatever they have for protection, and get ready to stay up tonight. I'll pay all of you double, but I need every hand available." Juan thought about it, finally nodding as he told Daddy that he could count on him. George followed him back inside, watching as he called the sheriff next and told him about what had happened. "I don't think this is just hellions out for Halloween pranks. Something weird is going on, and if you want to help, be here tonight after sunset. I'm gonna set a trap for them, and if we have enough hands, maybe we can settle this without violence." He nodded and mm-hummed into the phone, and when he hung up, George smiled and said he could count on him too. But his father shook his head. "No, I want you inside while this is going on. If anything happens, I want you to call the police and let them know to send more help. I know it's likely to be scary here all by yourself, but I want you to be brave, okay?" "Sure thing, Daddy. I'll be here if you need me." His dad had ruffled his hair then, smiling at his son with real pride. "I know you will, kiddo. I have faith in you, and I hope that after tonight, we can get back to farming and leave all this nonsense behind us." George hoped so too, but as they went about making plans and getting ready for the night to come, the hellions he had seen last night were never far from his mind. George stood at the window once again, watching the barn as it flickered with light. The sheriff had shown up around sunset with 3 other officers from the county station, and the 4 of them had gone off to join the dozen or so armed farmhands. Daddy had lit the pumpkins on the porch, their light glittering as the sun set over the fields. George could see them getting ready as he lit his own pumpkin, and the candle danced happily as the jack-o'-lantern smiled over the field. As night spread itself across the farm, George yawned and leaned against the windowsill. It had been a long day, and his eyes were getting heavy. He needed to stay up. He had to make sure that if Daddy needed his help, he could be there to call in that help. The moon rose to replace the sun, hanging full and ghostly over the remaining crop. George thought the east field looked weird without any pumpkins to add color to the dirt. Daddy and Juan and the other men had stacked them all up in the barn, and now they were just waiting to see if the men in the pumpkin masks would come back again. He had asked his dad if the men in the masks were the hellions he'd been talking about, but his father hadn't answered. He had looked strange when George had said the word masks, like he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. George hoped that that was the case. The alternative seemed to be that Daddy didn't think they were masks at all, which was far more scary. As George watched the barn, he yawned again, leaning on his hands as he tried to stay awake. He sat up a few seconds later, deciding that was much too comfy. He rubbed his eyes and stood up, trying to focus on the blurry barn that hunkered outside the croplands like a hunting cat. He could see his daddy out front, the shotgun held in his hand, and the sheriff in his furry coat standing next to him. George felt better with the sheriff there. He knew that his father didn't think much of him after the mess with the deputy, but George had always liked him. He was friendly, not prone to speaking harshly to the kids in town like some of the other men he hired, and he was always trying to help people. George snorted awake, that last blink having lasted a few seconds longer than he'd meant it to, and got up to walk around. He would not fall asleep. He would stay awake and keep watch. His daddy needed him to stay awake. If he needed help, he needed to be able to get it for him. He sat back on the window seat and rubbed his eyes angrily. He would stay awake. He would stay awake. He shook himself awake, realizing he'd fallen asleep. The scene outside his window had changed, and not for the better. The deep fog that had been there the night before had rolled in again, and George couldn't see anything beyond the front porch. The barn was a shadowy, flickering thing, sitting ghostly behind the fog. George could see shapes moving in that fog. There were flashes out there, the sounds of gunshots muffled as they came to him, and George realized that the Hellions were back. The lumpy heads of their attackers could barely be seen through the fog, but George saw many, many more than he'd seen the night before. There was something else out there, too. Something big. Its antlers poked up through the fog, and it moved much faster than any of the pumpkin men. It was cutting a sharp path for the barn, and George backed away from the window as a shudder ran through him. It had felt like the thing had seen him, though he didn't know how it could have. He didn't know how they were doing out there, but he remembered what his daddy had said. He needed to call for help. He flipped the light switch in the hallway, but it stayed dark. The thought of running past the open doors to dark rooms where a hand could be waiting to grab him, made his legs shake, and he went back to look for a flashlight. The flashlight wouldn't make the hands go away, but it would make him brave enough to do what he needed to do. The light on the nightstand was dead. The camp lantern in the closet was dry and would need more kerosene, and the matches he had would go out if he ran. He looked to the window, and that was when the answer came to him. He opened the window and took the pumpkin inside, the candle burning low, but still burning. He hugged it close as he ran down the hallway, holding the bottom so the candle wouldn't fall out. It threatened to gutter a few times, but as George came thumping down the stairs, he saw that it was still lit and breathed a sigh of relief. The living room was dark, but the moon coming in from outside provided a little bit of light. George went to the landline in the living room and dialed the familiar number that every child is taught in an emergency. He balanced the pumpkin in his arms as he put the phone to his ear, but the sound he heard made his blood run cold. The line was dead. Whatever was happening, they had cut the power. George looked at the front door, and suddenly he wanted nothing so much as to be with his father. His father would protect him. Daddy would make all the monsters go away. George was still young enough to believe in the talismanic power of his parents, and he needed to touch him and hug him close so that all the bad things would just be a bad dream the next morning. He came out onto the front porch before he could think better of it, and the door flapping shut behind him sounded as good as a dinner bell to any buggins nearby. The steps creaked ominously as George came down them with his jack-o'-lantern light. The fog was thick around him as he moved amongst the corn, and the barn was a bright torch off to his left. It felt too bright, like a beacon rather than the comforting light of lamps, and the closer he got, the more he could feel the heat as it baked away the fog. The barn was burning. George knew that somehow, but he still needed to get to his daddy. His father would make it all go away, just like when Mama died. He would make it all okay, and when he woke up in the morning, all this would just be a bad dream he'd had. He came out of the fog and saw the barn as it spewed ash into the sky. Whatever had been in there was gone now, and George prayed that his daddy was somewhere else. He came around the edge of the barn, towards the front, and the pumpkin was becoming heavy in his hands. Why was he still carrying it? He should have dropped it by now, but it seemed fitting that he keep it. The warmth was nice as the small candle burned its life away, and when he rounded the front, he saw the door sagging as it bulged against the inferno it barely contained. His father lay before the door. He was in two pieces. Something had cut him at the waist, and his daddy had fallen onto the dust of the barnyard. His gun was still in his hand, a scattering of shells around him where they had spilled from his hand, and George crouched beside him, feeling his tears rolling silently down his face. He was dead, his eyes wide and staring, and the look on his face was shocked, disbelieving, terrified. The snort of a horse brought him around, and George cradled the pumpkin as he stood to see what was coming for him. The rider broke the fog, his green armor glistening with the water from that hellish mist. His rack of antlers was magnificent as it sprouted from his sea-green helmet, but his eyes, the eyes of the rider, burned like the coals in a winter fire. He saw George, his horse pawing at the ground as if it longed to charge him, but the night stayed still as he and the boy locked eyes. As he stood, taking deep breaths, George felt cold in a way he had never felt before. He would have said such a thing was impossible, not with the barn burning so close behind him, but his arms and legs felt numb, and his teeth began to chatter as he locked eyes with the green warrior. He heard the plop before he was aware that he had dropped it, and when he glanced down, he saw the remains of the shattered jack-o'-lantern at his feet. "A shame," whispered a voice. It sounded like a corpse, whispering as it was forced from a frozen grave, and when George looked up, he saw the blade coming in fast and strong. He thought, this must be what the wheat sees before it is cut. It was his last thought before his head fell to join the ruined pumpkin. "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" Matthew was standing on the front porch, looking up at his mother through the eye holes of his homemade ghost costume. "Mom, I don't feel good. Maybe I won't go out tonight." His mom looked down at him, smiling in that strange way he had become so accustomed to. It was definitely supposed to be his mom, her red hair falling softly around her shoulders as she wore the thrift store bridal gown that she had ripped up for her zombie bride costume. But Matthew knew that it wasn't her. When she turned her head, he could hear the tendons creaking in her neck, and her rictus of a smile made the corners of her mouth turn up painfully. "Come on, honey. Halloween comes but once a year." Matthew sighed. If only that were the case. They stepped off the front porch, making their way into the throng of children that happily capered about the cul-de-sac. His ghost costume looked a little plain when compared to the others, but Matthew couldn't find it in himself to be self-conscious anymore. They weren't kids, at any rate. Not the kids he'd grown up with. Behind their colorful masks or painted faces, their oddly yellow eyelids were black, with soulless eyes. "I can't," Matthew said, letting his hand slip from his mother's. "Can't what, sweetie?" she asked, turning her painful smile on him. "I can't do this anymore," he yelled, throwing his bucket down and rounding on her. The throng of trick-or-treaters turned to stare at him, and Matthew suddenly realized his mistake. Not for the first time, and not for the last. "Sweetie," his mother said, turning slowly, her arms and legs like something full of coat hangers and newspaper. "It's Halloween. You either treat, or you get tricked." The kids began to circle around him, their voices low, their eyes shining like pools of tar. "Trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat." Matthew could hear his heart beating in his ears. He could almost hear it as he backed away. It was noisy, soupy, and constantly pounding, fundamentally different from a normal heartbeat in every way. He bumped into a teenage Michael Myers, and the big mute pushed him over before he could properly get his bearings. He fell down hard on his chest, and then they were on him. Luckily, as Matt lay face down on the concrete, he didn't have to watch this time. They ripped his back apart, their sharp little teeth digging into his flesh. He felt the warm blood oozing down his back, the asphalt drinking it up as the kids tore him apart. His arms separated with a sickening pop, his sheet tearing as it was ripped, and Matthew lost consciousness. He hoped that maybe this would be the last time, and that it all would end. He was so tired of being a ghost, tired of Halloween, and as the bright lights made him squint, he felt hot tears joining his blood on the pavement. "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" Matthew looked up at his mother, nodding as he reached up and took her hand for the 1,000th time. It didn't feel like a real hand, not anymore. It felt mushy in the wrong places, hard and unmoving in others, like a palsied claw after a loved one's had a stroke. She looked down at him, smiling like a corpse, and Matthew tried to ignore the fact that the skin around her ears was darker than it had been the last time. His mother appeared to be rotting before his eyes, but to make note of it would bring on something worse. He walked once more into the sea of children, watching them run and cheer, but feeling their eyes as they tracked him. The whole street was like living in a forest of lions. Any minute, they might spring from concealment and tear you to pieces. He had been here long enough to know, however, that as long as you played along with this everlasting Halloween, it was content to keep you in its clutches. As they came to the first house, Matthew could see old Mr. Debro as he smiled and stepped through the door. The liver spots on his head were starting to look more like mold, but Matthew tried to ignore it as he shook his bag half-heartedly. The old man would drop 2 small Kit Kats in there and tell him to have a great evening, just like he did every time. And Matthew just wanted to get on with the charade. When the candy didn't fall into the bag like it always did, Matt looked up and saw the grinning face of the old man as it loomed over him. "Forgot your manners, son?" Matthew gasped. He'd become so complacent. He'd been here long enough to know that you didn't get candy unless you said the magic words, but he was so tired. He'd been trick-or-treating for ages, and he was exhausted. Every time he finished, every time he came to the end, good or bad, it would all just begin again. He was starting to feel like if he looked at his own reflection, he might be the one that was beginning to rot. He tried to stammer out a hurried trick-or-treat, but he could already see the long, sharp legs as they protruded from the corners of the man's mouth. Whatever horrors that lay inside these things, already dragging itself free. The words came from what sounded like a drowned man's throat, or the dying voice of someone who's slowly choking to death. And Matthew heard it just as the pinchers on the horrific whatever it were shot out from between Mr. Debro's stained false teeth and latched onto his head. The teeth clicked together as they hit the ground like a set of sad castanets, but Matthew heard his words as he faded once more into black. "You'll have to remember next time." "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" Matt didn't even look up at her this time. He lifted his hand and grabbed a hold of her withered paw as he let her lead him into the cul-de-sac. He moved on autopilot, remembering only the words that must be said as they came to each house. The candy filled the bag, the grown-ups continuing to smile their hollow grins, and all the while, Matthew trudged onward. He saw the corner coming up, the junction of Marla and Casterly, and Matt saw someone that made him go cold inside. The man was dressed as Indiana Jones, bullwhip hanging jauntily off his waist, and when he turned to wave at someone who had called his name, Matthew steered his mother towards a different house, back the way they had come. "Come on, Mom, we missed the Jafford house. Miss Jafford wants to see your costume, remember?" His mother looked unsure, but she turned away, smiling as she allowed herself to be led. "All right, Matty, don't tug." Matt looked back as he left, seeing the man and knowing that he didn't want his mother to talk to him. She had talked to him once before, hadn't she? She had talked to him, and something bad had happened, but it didn't seem like something that had happened here. He didn't know, he couldn't really say, but when he saw the guy, the ear-shattering heartbeat had come on again, and he suddenly knew that letting her talk to him would be the scariest thing he had ever experienced. As the night went on, Matthew held out hope that the lights might start going off, and that he might be allowed to sleep. The bag was heavy, the pillowcase bulging oddly as it threatened to split, but still, He and his mother walked the streets of the cul-de-sac. How many times had he done this, Matt wondered. 100, 200, 1,000? It felt like an eternity as his sore feet slapped the pavement and his trainers threatened to fall to pieces. "Do you remember the first time, Mom?" he asked suddenly, his eyes heavy as he repositioned the bag to rub at them. "Your first Halloween?" she asked, looking down at him with that fishhook grin. "I sure do. You were so cute in your cow costume. You said ooh instead of moo, and the neighbors laughed and said you were adorable." "No," Matt said. "I mean the first time we did this." "Look over there," she said suddenly. "The Holsteins are waving. Let's go see what they have." Matt nodded, following behind her as she led him like a cow to the slaughter. Matthew remembered the first time. He remembered it well. He'd looked up into his mother's eyes and been so excited. He had run down the street, tugging her along as they went house to house to house. That had been the first time he'd seen the man on the corner, the first time he had steered her away from him, not understanding why. He had laughed when the pillowcase had ripped open, spilling his candy in the road, and when his mother had pulled another one out of nowhere, he had started filling that one too. The moon had been full, a big old round Halloween moon, and Matthew reveled in the light of the buttery orb. It had taken him a while to get tired, but he had finally asked Mom if they could go home so he could rest. She had tried to dissuade him, telling him they only had a few more houses, a little while longer. When he asked again, she had tried to push him on, but he had stopped. "I'm tired, Mama. I'm ready to go home." She had turned then, and that was the first time he had noticed the smile. Her smile, that sharp and painful grin that seemed sad as she looked at him, and he had known that there was something off. This wasn't what he had wanted. This hadn't been what he'd wanted. He had just wanted a Halloween that would... Matt swallowed, true fear creeping up in him as he looked at her unnatural smile and noticed that the children had stopped moving around them. He had just wanted a Halloween that would last forever. "Oh, sweetie," his mother had said, "you either get treats or you get tricks." That was when he had seen them for what they truly were. They had circled around him, chanting, "Trick or treat," and as they swarmed in, they had torn him to pieces with their bare hands. All the joy had melted off his face as their nails and teeth dug into him, and when he had woken up on the front porch, his mother asking if he was ready, he had known that something was amiss. "Matty?" Matthew looked up, seeing that Mrs. Holstein had asked him a question. "Sorry, ma'am, what were you saying?" "I asked if you were a scary ghost or not." She was smiling, but it was like Matt could see the bugs crawling under her skin. It made him think that each of them had some kind of centipede or spider beneath their skin, just waiting to leap out. All of them seemed to have something in them, just below the surface, and Matthew was no longer certain he wanted to know what it was. It was hungry, whatever it was, and it seemed to enjoy making him suffer for his slip-ups. "Yes, ma'am. He yawned, feeling wobbly as the candy sack tried to anchor him to the earth. "A scary go." He fell then, not for the first time either. He hit the ground, his mother asking him to get back up, but he was just so tired. Matthew closed his eyes, hoping he would pass out, but it never happened. He could feel the adults looming around him, hear the chants of "trick or treat," and when something slammed against his chest, he felt the breath whoosh out of him as it pierced his heart. He hoped it would be over this time, hoped he'd be allowed to die or wake up or whatever this was, but as he heard his mother's voice, he knew it wouldn't happen. "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" His tired eyes came open, but as he reached for her hand, a new thought occurred. "I forgot something inside. I'll be right back." He took a step for the door, but her hand clutched at him, just as it had the last time he'd tried this. "It'll be okay. We can get it later. Come on, let's..." But then he shoved her, and that seemed to take her by surprise. He ran inside, shutting the door as she got back to her feet. As he turned the deadbolt, she started pounding dully on the hardwood. "Now, Matty, you know how this works. You either get the treat, or you get the tricks." He could already hear the muffled cries of "trick or treat" coming from behind the door, and he backed away slowly as he watched it. He wasn't strong enough to push the couch in front of the door, or even one of the recliners, but he did shove the end table in the hallway over as he went running up the stairs to close the door to his room behind him. He locked the door and squeezed himself into the corner as he threw the sheet he was still wearing across the room. He could hear a loud thumping coming from downstairs, and he didn't think that door would keep them out for long. He racked his brain, trying to figure out how to get out of this. He thought back across all those trick-or-treating trips, all the nights that had come before this, and his mind always went back to the man in the wide-brimmed hat. He was scared of him in a way that he wasn't of any of the others. Not the bugs or the feral kids or anything he'd seen scared him as much as that man. Why, though? Why did he terrify him so much? Why did he fill him with dread like this? "I want you to meet someone." He covered his ears, but the voice wasn't coming from the house. "He's kind of important to me, just like you." He put his head between his knees and started crying as the door broke loudly from downstairs, and the words of the children came wafting up to him. "I've been seeing him sometimes, after work or while you're at Grandma's for the weekend, and I think he might be..." But the rest of it droned down to a low growl as his brain hit the brakes on it. He tried desperately to remember what his mother had said, but he couldn't. His mind struggled with the memory, but as he tried to make it make sense, he heard them pounding on the bedroom door. They were pushing, threatening to break the door, and he curled into a ball as he tried to make the memories come back. Trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat! They came thundering into the room, and as they fell on him, one thought broke the surface above all the others. He needed to face his fears and go see that man. One clear word stuck out in his brain, though, as he was pummeled into oblivion. No. "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" The words still sounded in his brain, even after the last few times. Matthew had gone along with her for the last however many times, to varying degrees of success. He always avoided the man, always turned her back into the endless cul-de-sac of candy-laden houses, but it always ended the same. He forgot his manners, he went off script and tried to escape. He simply fell over out of exhaustion, and then they had him. He reached for her hand again, and as they walked, his brain tried to argue itself into sense, just like it had the last however many times. They needed to talk to the man at the end of the block. No. "Trick or treat," Matt droned, Mr. Deborah smiling as the legs sat just inside his cheeks, a silent warning to be careful. "He knows something. Maybe it's how we get out of this." No. Come on, Mom. Let's go to the Andersons," Matt said, stalling for time. "They're not going anywhere, honey," she said as he pulled her along, her lips looking chapped as she smiled and smiled. "He has to know something. We need to..." "No." "Are you a scary ghost?" Miss Holstein asked, and Matt nodded as he told her he was, indeed, a scary ghost. "But if we just..." No, 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 no! Matt finally yelled, clutching his head as he fell to his knees in the road. He wanted his brain to shut up. He was tired. He was so tired. He wanted to go to bed. He just wanted this all to end. He just... That's when he noticed that they were looking at him. Matt closed his eyes, and oblivion came on not too much later. Well, not oblivion. Something more like purgatory. "Ready to..." But he shoved her again and went running down the street, ghost costume flapping as he jumped off the porch. The kids were after him in a second, but Matt didn't care. They would get him, one way or another, but he just needed a break from the constant tricking and treating. He was running up the street, the crowd behind him, and when he looked up, the children seemed to bulge with the scrabbling things as well. They were full of bugs, full of hate, and Matthew needed a way to get beyond this. He turned back just in time to bump into someone, and as he fell down, he covered his head, expecting to be killed by the howling mob. When it didn't come, Matt looked up to see who he had run into. "Need a hand up, little buddy?" It was the man in the Indiana Jones costume, and to Matt, he looked like the closest thing to an angel he'd ever seen. Matt took his hand, shaking a little as he looked behind him. The mob had stopped, watching the man in confusion, and as Matthew looked up through the eyes of his ghost costume, he became aware that this fellow looked different. He looked real, untouched by this place, and Matt wondered why he'd been afraid of him. "It's great to finally meet you, Matt. Your mother's told me all about you, and I've been looking forward to meeting you. I'm Derek. I guess I'm your mom's..." But the words seemed to slow down, and the dread came back into Matthew. As the mob came back to screaming life, Matt realized why he had been afraid of this guy. Matthew turned, wanting to run away, but he was blinded by bright lights and put his hands up to stop them. As he fell into oblivion, Matthew came to terms with what he had to do, and he hoped that he still had the strength. He needed to face his fears, otherwise he'd be stuck here forever. "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" He looked up into his mother's smiling face, the corners of her mouth red as they threatened to crack, and shook his head. "Not yet, Mom. We're missing someone." He reached up and took her hand, and as they walked off towards the thing he feared most, the kids parted for them. They watched him, chanting their infernal mantra, and it seemed that he had the eyes of the entire neighborhood. As he walked towards the swollen moon, he felt it swivel in the sky, and the craters too seemed to watch him as he made a beeline for the spot he had tried to avoid. It wasn't easy. Each step felt like the first step towards a high dive at the pool, or the roller coaster at the amusement park. He could see the man, his hat at a jaunty angle, and as they moved closer to him, all the people around them held their breath. "Julia," Derek said, raising his hand and walking over. "And this must be Matthew. Good to meet you, buddy. I'm Derek." He put out a hand, and Matt shook it heartily. "Matty, I want you to meet someone," his mother said. "He's kind of important, like you, and I've been seeing him sometimes, after work or while you're at Grandma's for the weekend. I think he might be someone you'll be seeing a lot more of in the future. Matthew, this is Derek. He's my boyfriend." Matt told him it was a pleasure to meet him, and he watched the two of them talking quietly, expecting that now things would go back to the way they were. This was it. This was one of those storybook moments that would turn everything back the way it was supposed to be. Matthew smiled as he watched her slip his hand into his, and it felt like everything would be okay now. When the first person began to scream, he felt a little less sure than he had been before. The mob of children had followed them, the adults standing out like sore thumbs amongst them, and many of them were pointing at him. The huge moon that he had thought of as an eye only moments before cracked like an egg as it burst into two pieces. It began to rain something down on them, something that didn't look entirely pleasant. They slapped against his ghost costume wetly, but as one fell across the eye hole, Matt saw that they were bugs. They looked like a cross between a centipede and a spider, and as he threw it away, the crowd began to surge towards him. Matt ran, the only thing he could do, and as his mother and Derek stood amongst the throng of chasers, they looked like rocks in a rushing river. He ran, his sore feet almost spilling him into the road more than once. He'd been so sure that this would work, that this would free him, but now he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. The creepy crawlies were biting him as they covered the outside of his costume, weighing him down and making him sore. As the mob closed in, their cries of "trick or treat" sounded like a war chant, and Matt saw bright lights coming up fast. He put a hand up, shielding his eyes, but he didn't dare stop running. As the lights bore down on him, he hoped he would wake up anywhere besides the front porch of his house. Heaven, hell, nothingness, whatever was coming next, Matthew welcomed it with open arms. The cries of the mob were driven into blissful silence, only to be replaced by a harsh and rhythmic beeping. Matt opened his eyes as his hand shot up to slap at his ear, making his head ring. He could see a pristine hospital room with a beeping IV pole attached to one arm, and the warm sun of mid-morning outside the big window. His mother was snoring softly as she lay across his feet, and as he moved his prickly legs to make them wake up, she stirred and looked at him in surprise. "Oh my God, Matthew!" She wrapped him in a hug, his IV making him feel pinched, but he was happy to have woken up somewhere different for a change. "Hey, Mom, what's going on?" She smoothed his hair, her eyes wet-looking as she tried to commit him to memory. You got hit by a car, sweetie. You ran away while we were trick-or-treating after—" She opened her mouth like a fish, but shook it off. It's not important. What's important is that you're awake. Where's Derek? The vision of the two of them standing stationary as the group of screaming children poured past them, still very vivid in his mind. He's been by a few times. He wanted to make sure you were okay. I told him I might need to take a break, though. I didn't mean to upset you when I told you. I knew it was sudden, but I shouldn't have said it so quickly. I should have eased you into it. I'm sorry, Maddie, she said, half crying. It's okay. I was just surprised. I shouldn't have run away. You should call him and let him know that everything's okay. His mother looked shocked, but happy. She'd clearly been worried for a while, but she was happy that Matthew was awake again. She stood up, asking if he wanted something to drink, and Matt nodded in the affirmative. His throat was very dry, and it felt like a while since he had used it properly. It wasn't until the sun set that night that Matthew became anxious again. His mother excused herself, saying she needed to get some food and maybe call Derek and tell him that Matthew was okay. She had sat with him all day, watching cartoons and just kind of holding him, but it appeared that her lack of lunch was catching up with her. The hospital was quieter now, the night shift still in full swing, but she still stopped before heading out the door. You'll be okay for a few minutes, right? You look a little pale, like there's something on your mind. Matt assured her that he'd be fine, but he was still a little happier once she was out the door. As another yawn shot through him, Matthew thought about how his body would make him sleep soon, and he thought of something he should have considered earlier today. He hadn't noticed right away, but when he had brought his hand down from his ear, he had wiped something onto the sheet. He must have rolled it up in the sheet somehow, because he hadn't thought about it until he had put his hand onto the spot a while later. His mother had been in the bathroom, the door open so she could peek out at him to make sure he hadn't just disappeared, and when he unbound the sheet, he saw something far too familiar there, staining the sheet brown and red as it pressed against him. It was part of the things that had been falling out of the moon, the head and pincers of that strange centipede spider thing. He had picked it up in a napkin and thrown it in the garbage before his mother could see it. But what did it mean? Did it mean all that had been real? Had the creature come from inside his head? Matt didn't know what to think, but he found himself wondering something as he lay there, feeling tired. When he went to sleep, would he wake up in the real world, or would he fall back into that eternal Halloween? Matt was afraid that he might find out soon enough.